Hi there. In this, I'm going to be talking about American politics for debate. A couple of caveats before diving in. First, this is not a lecture that intends to describe the structure of American government. I have a separate lecture back from the summer of 2022 that explains the structure of the US government, although the politics by that point were, of course, quite different than late 2025. And this is also not a video that aims to provide a detailed post-mortem or analysis of the 2024 presidential election and what went wrong for Democrats. I have a separate lecture from the fall of 2024 that covers that topic in some depth. Rather, this presentation will focus more on contemporary American politics, particularly in the age of the second Trump administration. So, sort of the first year of Trump's presidency. Obviously, lots of this information is time variable, which is just to say that some of this will change over time. For example, the specific nature of the inflation rate in the United States will change depending on Trump's policy, the effect of tariffs, and so forth. Whether Trump pursues regime change in Venezuela is subject to change, or the scale of the airstrikes against alleged narco boats in the Caribbean will change over time. The Epstein files have recently been released, at least in a redacted capacity, and the fallout from that will take time to play out. Obviously, the 2026 midterms are likely to change in terms of the candidates that run and the likely or suspected outcomes. So lots of this information will change over time. I'll try to provide general analysis that transcends the specifics of December 2025, but just keep in mind that lots of this information will quickly become out of date. Second caveat is this presentation will probably be the most biased presentation I've given. What I mean by that is, although I'll try to provide a series of perspectives on American politics, there's a pretty good chance that I'm not going to provide, for instance, a particularly fair account of some parts of the Democratic Party and large parts of the Trumpist movement. And there's also a good chance that at points I'll insert opinionated commentary. I'll try to flag where I do that. For example, my personal disdain for Gavin Newsom will probably be very apparent. So I'll try to flag where I'm inserting personal beliefs and what is alternatively just objective commentary on American politics, but keep that in mind. Third, because this presentation aims to survey a range of perspectives on American politics, including different accounts of what the Democratic Party should do moving into the future, and even some competing accounts of the Republican Party and where it offers promise and where it doesn't, some parts of this presentation will probably irritate you. What I mean by that is that I'll cover a range of views and arguments that differ in terms of their relative persuasiveness, and you might find some of them more or less compelling. This is not a reflection of my personal views. This is just a sort of survey of competing conceptions of how the Democratic and Republican parties approach governance and campaigning. Lastly, this presentation will not focus all that much on American policy. For example, I'll talk in some detail about Trump's second term, but I won't spend much time discussing, say, the economic ramifications of mass deportations or the effect of Trump's airstrikes on Iran's nuclear weapons program. This is more intended to focus on the politics of American government, the major parties involved, the major figures involved, the trajectory of the American political system, and to focus on areas of American politics that are useful for debate. That being said, I'll just add as a final caveat that this presentation is mostly aimed at providing context as opposed to providing arguments. So rather than focus on, for instance, common arguments about the Democratic or Republican parties that show up in debates, I'll cover that implicitly, but spend a bit more time focusing on general first principles that you can deploy when characterizing the features of the American political system. It's also worth flagging at the top that American politics appears in a couple of forms in debate. Sometimes American politics is debated directly. For example, you'll just get a motion that's directly about American politics, a motion, for example, about what the Democratic Party should do in its advocacy. Sometimes you'll get motions that are not directly about American politics, but involve a political angle. For example, there might be some cases where you'll be debating about a broader foreign policy issue or an economic policy matter, and some part of the debate will then involve questions of American politics. For instance, there are lots of motions that will change depending on who is in the White House in 2028. For example, whether the Trumpist faction of the Republican Party continues to have influence past Trump, or whether this is something that is temporary and fades. And so in that sense, having the ability to argue about American politics is relevant on a range of topics beyond just those directly about the American political system. The final way that American politics can show up in debate is just that lots of American actions affect the rest of the world, whether you like it or not, and right nowadays, especially not like it. So, for example, US financial regulation affects the probability of a US financial crisis, which in turn affects the state of the global economy. US military interventions affect the stability of regions outside the United States. Venezuela right now would be a good example of that. And so, to that extent, being able to argue about American politics is useful, even if the debate has nothing to do directly with the United States. So I'm going to cover three broad things in this presentation. I'm going to start by talking about the politics of Trump and the MAGA movement. Then I'll talk a bit about the Democratic Party. And lastly, and more briefly, I'll talk directly about the 26 midterms and the 2028 presidential election and arguments that you might make about those. So let's start with Trump. So the obvious context is Trump won the 2024 election back in November and stormed back into power after being ousted by Biden circa the 2020 election and being largely disgraced across much of the United States following the January 6, 2021 Capitol riots and failed attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. So it's worth briefly reiterating the pathway to how Trump regained power in the 2024 election. Obviously, Trump loses the election in November of 2020. COVID certainly doesn't help, as does the fact that the American economy was suffering from elevated levels of unemployment and generally low consumer sentiment. Trump does not accept the results of the 2020 election and claims that the election was rigged against him. This is the so-called big lie. Consequently, Trump attempts to subvert the 2020 election result. Everyone has heard of the January 6th riot. That's when hundreds of Trump supporters, encouraged directly by Trump's rhetoric, stormed the Capitol, resulting in around 9 deaths. 5 died during the raid, or I think it was around 5 is the number. 4 died by suicide afterwards, mostly law enforcement. But the part of the January 6th scheme that you might be less familiar with, but is arguably more important, or at least equally important to understand, is the fake electors plot. For context, Trump tried in many ways to overturn the election. For example, you might remember that back after the election, Trump called the Secretary of State of Georgia, which was one of the swing states, and more or less demanded that the Georgia Secretary of State find Trump something like 11 to 12,000 additional votes in Trump's favor to swing the outcome of the election. Trump filed dozens of lawsuits across the United States to try to overturn the election. But the most substantial of Trump's efforts to overturn the election was this quote unquote fake electors plot. The exact details of the fake electors plot isn't particularly important to know. They're based on something called the Eastman memos, which was a very, very fringe legal theory that undergirded Trump's approach to overturn the 2020 election. The important feature to understand about the fake electors plot was that it aimed to invalidate the traditional process for the Electoral College, which is the system by which American presidents are elected, by more or less submitting fake or really illegitimate electors from several critical states in an attempt to ensure that Trump would win the election in the eyes of the US Congress as opposed to Biden. The vice president of the United States, of course, then Mike Pence, did not agree to cooperate with this. He viewed it as illegitimate and illegal. That ultimately led to the failed insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th. In the aftermath, Biden gained power, as was the norm, and governed throughout the next 4 years. In June 2024, Biden, who at the time was the Democratic candidate for president, had a disastrous debate performance against Donald Trump and subsequently dropped out of the presidential race several weeks later in mid-July. The vice president, Kamala Harris, then became the Democratic nominee for president. Although Harris attempted to portray Trump as a threat to democracy and as a threat to abortion rights, voters largely punished Harris at the ballot box. Many voters were heavily dissatisfied with high levels of inflation. They were dissatisfied with the existing administration, which Harris made very little attempt to distance herself from. And Harris, of course, had just 107 days to run the campaign and was ultimately unsuccessful in winning any one of the 7 swing states. By the way, there's an interesting piece from Michael Huemer, who himself adopted the piece from a separate political scientist and philosopher. That's sort of an interesting critique of the argument that Trump makes about the 2020 election being stolen stolen. It's worth reading, not for debate reasons. It's just kind of interesting. The TLDR of the argument is, if it really is true, according to Donald Trump, that is, that the 2020 election was stolen, that actually makes Trump seem awfully weak and should arguably undermine Trump's appeal, not strengthen it. But just a random side note. One of the common arguments that was made after the 2024 election, in fact, I surveyed this argument to some extent last year, is the argument that Trump's win in the 2024 election constituted a political realignment. In other words, the 2024 election didn't just see Donald Trump win. The argument was that Trump won in a historic manner, which represented a major change in voting patterns amongst key demographics. Now, there's some empirical support for that argument. For example, Trump was the first president to win the popular vote in roughly 2 decades. And Trump also enjoyed increased voter support amongst many demographics that historically voted pretty reliably for the Democrats. Now, there's a misconception here, which is just to say, these groups did not all start majority voting for Trump and the Republicans. The point is that there was a shift in support towards Trump away from the Democrats. For example, the vast majority of black voters still voted for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, but particularly amongst black men, there was a swing towards Trump relative to the 2020 and 2016 elections. The argument that was made at the time, and to some extent is still made now, is that Trump's success with these demographics constituted a fundamental change in how different racial and age-based groups voted. For example, the shift of young voters, especially young male voters, was perceived by especially some conservative commentators as evidence that the Democratic Party had lost huge portions of its historic base, and therefore represented a major threat to the viability of the Democratic Party in the long run. As it turns out, this argument is probably a bit exaggerated. The simplest empirical claim you could make here is just that Trump's victory was not the landslide that Trump typically claims. For example, Trump won the popular vote but only by about 1.5 percentage points, which is not a particularly devastating margin, especially in comparison to previous elections. In fact, there's an interesting argument that Kamala Harris arguably outperformed. That's a bit of a hard argument to swallow, of course. She lost and ran a rather poor campaign. For example, late in the race, Harris doubled down very heavily on the argument that Trump threatened democracy, when internal polls within the Harris campaign showed that that was not the most effective strategy to go for. But nonetheless, it's worth pointing out that Harris was heavily associated with the Biden-Harris administration. After all, she was the vice president and was very unwilling to criticize Biden publicly, and yet Harris actually outperformed Biden's approval rating at the time, which was, depending on the polls that you look at, in the high 30s or low 40s in terms of the percentage of Americans that viewed Biden favorably or approved of the job that he'd done. Harris received around 48% of the vote. And it's actually remarkable in some sense that Harris was able to do that well. And to that extent, you might say, well, Harris actually didn't lose in a smashing manner. It just was the case that in an environment where many voters were dissatisfied with inflation, and there's been a wave of political damage dealt to incumbent parties circa 2024, it's unsurprising that Trump ended up winning the election. The strongest argument, though, against the claim that 2024 was a political realignment is the empirical outcomes from the 2025 elections in the United States. I'll talk about this more later, but the TLDR for now is that the Democrats largely recaptured key support from major demographics, particularly racial demographics, in the 2025 elections. Now, the 2025 elections are an off-year election, so they're an odd-year election. For example, these were largely governor races or special races or races for mayorships, as opposed to races for example, the House or for the presidency, which tend to be higher turnout elections where the people who vote might vote in different ways than the people who vote in off-year elections. But nonetheless, there's pretty compelling evidence now that 2024 did not fundamentally represent a shift in where different groups cast their ballots. This is just a sort of empirical representation, by the way, of what that shift looked like back in 2024. If you compare nearly every major demographic, including major demographics that Democrats historically had polled well with, like, for example, Hispanic or Latino voters, there was a pretty major swing towards Trump. Now, the argument that you might make for why this is important or worrying for the Democrats is for why the 2025 election should therefore offer comfort to the Democrats is that the 2025 elections, for example, in places like New Jersey or Virginia, maybe suggested that this was a temporary deviation. So this graph here on the left is a little bit hard to follow, but the TLDR of what it's showing basically is how majority Hispanic towns voted, Democrat or Republican, between the 2020 presidential election and the 2025 elections in places like Virginia, uh, the Miami governor races in New York, et cetera. And what you can sort of see here in 2024 is that there's a swing towards the right amongst majority Hispanic towns, and then a sharp correction back towards the left, back towards the Democratic Party. And you can similarly see the margins by which Democrats outperformed the 2024 elections in 25 is perhaps further evidence of this. Now, it's worth pointing out that American politics differ from European politics in very many ways, but maybe one of the most important is, although American political pundits like to spend lots of time talking about the voters who change who they vote for or change whether they turn out or not, a major feature of the American political landscape is fairly intense polarization. And polarization has lots of variations. There are lots of ways in which a society can be polarized. One of the important polarized versions of polarization in the United States, though, is the concept of negative partisanship. What this basically means is that not only are Americans ideologically polarized in the sense that there is a disagreement between liberals and conservatives along ideological grounds, but there's also fairly intense emotional polarization in the United States in the sense that Democrats increasingly dislike Republicans and vice versa. And there's lots of interesting ways that you can measure this. One example of this is you can pull people's attitude towards the government and the degree to which they're happy with it based on their political leanings. And you can sort of see that people are more happy with the government on average when it aligns with their particular political views. But more importantly, people are increasingly dissatisfied with the government when it's not in their camp. Of course, this might not be evidence of negative polarization. It could just be evidence that, people dislike when the other side's policies are implemented. But there's even more compelling evidence of this. For instance, there's this interesting graph from the New York Times that's pretty interesting research that finds that polarization actually affects where people move. Of course, causation and correlation are not the same, but there's a real trend for people to, when moving, move to areas that are more politically aligned with their existing beliefs. The other piece of evidence that's commonly cited of negative partisanship is decreasing engagement between the left and the right. So, for example, the number of people who say that they'd be willing to date or marry someone of the opposing political spectrum has, according to at least a good number of polls, gone down over the course of time, which might be evidence of this affective polarization of increasing hatred of the other side. That, of course, has major implications for politics. For example, one of the major arguments that you'll hear both political parties nowadays in the United States make is vote for us because the other guys are terrifying. In fact, this was one of the major arguments that Harris repeatedly relied on throughout the 2024 campaign. The main argument that Harris would often deploy is vote for me to stop Donald Trump from ruining the country. But of course, Trump and the Republicans make very similar arguments. For example, that Democrats are going to tear the country apart, that Democrats are going to let America be invaded by swarms of illegal migrants, etc. And so there is very much on both sides of the political spectrum deep-seated fear of the other. Now, there are lots of competing explanations for why the US is polarized. Some of them are fairly straightforward. So, for instance, one very simple hypothesis for why the United States is so polarized is social media and the rise of cable news that results in people largely consuming partisan media. For example, algorithms will push media that you're likely to agree with or sensational media that's going to make you outraged towards you in a way that results in you becoming more and more extreme over time. One of the more interesting arguments is the argument that Ezra Klein makes in Why We're Polarized. It's a good book to read if you want a more historical account of the evolution of American political parties. A large chunk of the book is devoted to how American parties became more ideologically narrow. So, for example, if you go back towards the mid-20th century, the two major political parties in the United States, i.e. the Democrats and Republicans, were in many ways more ideologically diverse than they are today, in the sense that there was a real broad range from liberal to conservative within both the Democratic and Republican parties. And what's happened, particularly in the last 3 decades, is an ideological narrowing of both parties. One of the important consequences of that is this concept of identity stacking. What that basically means is that people increasingly associate their political identity, like whether they're a Democrat or Republican, with their personal identity, and that also then gets layered onto other identity characteristics like their race, their gender, their geography, their class, in a way that creates these fairly rigid identity associations. What that consequently means is that when you attack a party, you're not just attacking people's ideological beliefs, like what do you think is the correct tax rate or what is the appropriate level of immigration. You're also attacking people's identities, and you're also attacking to the broader group that you belong to or identify belonging to. And one of the consequences of that is that people become very tribalistic, which is perhaps, for instance, why if you are a Republican, you are very skeptical of Democrats if you view them as a threat to your group or a threat to your community, which means that there's a rallying effect whereby you rally around your in-group in a way that increases polarization and leads the left and the right further towards the extremes. And maybe the simplest piece of evidence for this is go back to the 2016 election and really think for a moment about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, by all accounts, a remarkably unusual Republican candidate. I mean, think about the very simple, just nature of Trump's candidacy. Trump was an extraordinarily unconventional Republican. He bucked many historically conservative traditions. He was openly critical of free trade. He was, by his actions and speech, not very pure by Christian standards. So it's very confusing why so many traditional Republican voters would evaluate Trump on the merits and say, well, we're going to vote for this guy because he is a conservative. But the simplest reason why, the vast majority of Republicans or people who voted Republican in 2012 still voted for Trump in 2016 is perhaps this domain of polarization. If you're afraid of the other side and you have an in-group bias, you're naturally inclined to vote for your party again and again and again in a way that results in an ossification of the American political system. The other piece of, or the related piece of evidence here for this is what you could call the decline of partisan defection or the decrease in electoral volatility. This is an interesting case where the United States is different than Europe. If you look at lots of major European countries today, for instance, there's an inverse trend whereby people switch parties at higher and higher rates, particularly in countries with proportional representation voting systems. That's less the case in the United States because the first past the post system means that there are functionally just two political parties and there's no viable way for a third party to break onto the national scene. But people have, in the United States in the last several decades, become increasingly attached to their existing party in a way that might potentially make it difficult to change. That being said, this doesn't mean that swing voters don't exist. Swing voters, independent voters, etc., still matter quite a lot. Something like, depending on what numbers you're looking at, perhaps upwards of 20% of Americans might still identify as independent voters, and a large number of Americans still identify as moderate voters. So the fact that some domains of the American political system are heavily polarized does not mean the entire structure is heavily polarized. By the way, there's two other versions of polarization that are worth understanding. One is what's called the diploma divide. This is the concept of educational polarization, which is an empirical observation that the Democratic Party has become increasingly the party of well-educated voters, and the inverse is true for Republicans. For example, college-educated voters are now much more likely to vote for Democrats, and non-college-educated voters are increasingly voting Republican. That creates some major problems for the Democratic Party. One reason for this is that it structurally disadvantages the Democratic Party in rural areas. Rural areas are naturally overweighted in the American political system, like in the Senate, for example. The reason why is that the United States apportions seats in the Senate by geography as opposed to by population. So, in other words, the Senate gives two senators to each U.S. state. But U.S. states differ wildly in their populations. Think North Dakota versus Carolina, versus California. But California and North Dakota will both get two Senate seats. So on a per capita basis, the value that you have in a vote in North Dakota is strictly higher than that in California in the Senate, just because there are far more people in California than in North Dakota. The reason that's a problem for the Democrats is that rural areas are, on average, less likely to have college-educated voters comprising a large plurality or majority of voters. And if Republicans are reliably winning in rural areas, there's an inbuilt advantage for the Republican Party in a place or geography-based political system that awards votes based on location as opposed to population, at least in the Senate, even if that's not as true in the House. The other implication of educational polarization is that it negatively affects the Democratic Party's national brand. So if you do polling, lots of people will say one of the main problems of the Democratic Party isn't that it's too woke, or isn't even that it's too corporate. It's just that it's just that the Democratic Party is the party of sort of well-educated people who are pretty out of touch with what regular working class people need and want and think like and talk like. And that creates messaging problems for the Democratic Party in a way that's a bit difficult to fix if the donor base and the staffing base and the sort of politicians base of the Democratic Party it draws so heavily from a well-educated group. The other type of polarization that's worth thinking about is engagement polarization. This is basically the phenomena that the more engaged with news media you are, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. There is, of course, a bit of a causation correlation problem here. So, for instance, even just extrapolating from the diploma divide, there might be a connection, for instance, between level of education and level of political engagement. But one of the major issues for the Democrats is that low information consuming voters are more likely to vote for Republicans, which in turn creates problems for Democrats vis-a-vis getting the message out and for convincing and persuading voters to vote for their cause. So that's the general context on polarization and how Trump got to power circa the current moment in the 2024 election. I want to do a brief detour into just talking about what Trump believes in. The reason why this is useful is a lot of debates about the United States these days end up involving a clash, which basically is how is Trump going to behave or what policy is Trump going to implement? And candidly, this is a really hard question to answer. It's not at all obvious that you can easily figure out what Trump does or doesn't believe in. For example, Trump routinely contradicts himself. Trump acts in ways that are a bit difficult to explain logically. Trump's behavior is erratic and often narcissistic in a way that is pretty difficult to predict. So the most recent example that's very popular for everyone to think about is Trump recently met, really about a month ago, I suppose now, with the mayor-elect of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, who is a Muslim and a self-described democratic socialist and a person who has repeatedly called Trump a fascist. Just about everyone, myself included, thought that this meeting was going to go just disastrously in the sense of there being a major dispute between Mamdani and Trump. Instead, the meeting went crazily well for Mamdani. Trump posted pictures of himself and Mamdani smiling and shaking hands, and just a solo shot of Mamdani on his Truth Social account. Trump had some really, really kind words from Mamdani. No one really expected that in a way that sort of demonstrates that Trump psychology can be a bit difficult to predict, and it's a bit silly for debaters to pretend like we're particularly good at predicting how Trump is going to behave. That being said, one of the probably best bases of knowledge to have is just a broad understanding of what Trump has done with his power and with his time in the presidency. In terms of economics, Trump is pretty well known for his tariff agenda. It's not clear in all cases what Trump looks to achieve with his tariffs. There are lots of potential motives that Trump has identified. One is just increasing revenue. There's a simple argument that Trump has made, which is just tariffs bring in money, and that maybe allows the United States to give a tariff dividend to American voters, as Trump has sometimes expressed, although the economics on that are baffling. Maybe this is just a way to reduce the deficit in a way that means that Trump can claim that he's reducing the national debt. Of course, that hasn't happened yet, and Trump has added to the national debt rather substantially through the quote-unquote big, beautiful bill, which was Trump's major spending bill. One other argument you'll often hear from Trump is that the United States needs to reduce the trade deficit, and as a consequence, it needs to impose tariffs on its trade partners. That, of course, contradicts some of Trump's other rationales. For example, Trump imposed a sweeping series of tariffs on countries that the United States actually has trade surpluses with. And so it's not clear whether this logic holds particularly well. One argument that Trump has pursued is that if the United States imposes reciprocal tariffs, it can force countries to renegotiate trade deals to give the U.S. more favorable terms. For example, that's what the United States sort of got out of the European Union. And the United States has also gotten lots of its allies to pledge to invest billions or even trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy. It's worth pointing out that lots of those promises are a bit hollow. They're words on a sheet of paper. Lots of countries seem to have recognized that they can pledge to do things that, of course, will in reality take many years or decades to play out. But that might be enough to get Trump to back off if he sort of thinks that he's got the win. And one other argument that Trump and his advisors have made for tariffs is spurring manufacturing growth. The logic is that the United States will protect domestic manufacturers to bring back blue-collar manufacturing work. Of course, the economics on that is pretty suspicious, especially if imported intermediate goods rise in cost. The other domain of Trump's economic policy beyond tariffs is his approach towards tax policy and the federal government. So Trump is a large supporter of tax cuts for large corporations and wealthy individuals. That was most famously codified through the Big Beautiful Bill, or BBB. That also included fairly steep cuts to components of Medicaid. That's effectively a form of state-run or state-provided insurance for low-income American families, and in particular for low-income American parents. That's going to cause eventually a pretty substantial degree of political retaliation. You might remember back in September, the Democrats did what's called a government shutdown. Basically, they refused to collaborate for several weeks with the Republicans to pass a spending bill. And in doing so, caused the government to shut down nearly all non-essential services. Now, what's interesting about the government shutdown is that the Democrats framed it around a particular component of healthcare policy, in which there are subsidies and credits that are due to expire. And Democrats basically said, we're not going to vote to reopen the government until we extend these healthcare subsidies to ensure that healthcare costs remain affordable. The government shutdown was disagreeable for many Democrats. Democrats weren't sure it would work. The shutdown lasted through October into early November. And to many analysts' surprise, the shutdown actually seemed to be working at least somewhat in changing public attitudes towards Trump. For example, Trump's approval rating did fall. And if you looked at polling, a lot of polls did show that people blamed Trump more than the Democrats for the shutdown. Part of the reason for that is that Trump, unlike most presidents during shutdowns, made very little effort to publicly signal any willingness to cooperate or to collaborate. In fact, Trump repeatedly berated the Republican Party for not moving to the so-called nuclear option, which would mean abolishing the filibuster in the Senate. And as a consequence, the Democrats were, by most accounts, sort of gaining political ground in the shutdown. Unexpectedly, after the Democrats performed quite well in the elections back in November or early November 2025, a small number of Democrats defected from the shutdown effort and agreed to vote to reopen the government. It's a bit confusing why that was. There are competing accounts for why the Democrats agreed to end the shutdown. Probably the simplest is just that the Democratic Party and many members of the Democratic Party were concerned about the effects of the shutdown on their constituencies. For example, food stamps were coming under major threat, which provide food assistance to low-income families and communities. And there were lots of Democrats who were probably concerned about the continued effects of that. Other Democrats were more broadly concerned that holding out wasn't going to achieve much. It was, if anything, maybe going to give Trump more power and the ability to reshape the federal workforce. Other Democrats were concerned that the longer the shutdown went on, the greater the risk that Republicans would nuke the filibuster. That, of course, would potentially increase the power of the majority in the Senate, which would no longer be constrained by that risk of a filibuster. And the only way to overcome the filibuster would be to have at least 60 votes, which means that the Democrats, which have a minority, but enough for the Republicans to not reach 60 votes on their own without Democratic support, would potentially give the Republicans more legislative power. And there's a couple of other theories that have been floated around for why the Democrats ultimately weren't willing to hold out on the shutdown. For example, there are some theories that Chuck Schumer and Democratic leaders sort of quietly maneuvered to encourage the passage of a spending bill so that Democrats who are up for re-election in purple states in 2026 don't have to suffer the potential consequences. That being said, the decision by the Democrats to terminate the shutdown was quite confusing because they didn't receive the core demand they'd asked, which is clear passage of extending the Obamacare subsidies and credits in a way that the Democrats had said was their original aim. And so in that sense, many people viewed the shutdown decision by the Democrats as a major failure because it ended up giving power to the Republicans and more or less giving Republicans most of what they asked for without giving Democrats much in return, except for a flimsy promise to eventually hold a vote, which doesn't really carry that much water. So that's largely the overview of Trump's economic policy. The other thing that might be worth remembering is DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. That was the sort of oddly created government agency charged with reducing wasteful government spending that was led by Elon Musk. The exact scale of spending cuts by Doge is a bit difficult to determine. So Doge claims to have cut hundreds of billions of dollars in wasteful spending. There's lots of different accounts that you can read on exactly how accurate that number is and exactly how expensive the cuts themselves were. What we do know for sure is that Doge led to a good number of public sector federal government employees losing their jobs. There were some of those job layoffs that were struck down by courts, and some workers were given back their jobs, but particularly in sectors that are opposed by Trump, for example, think agencies related to public health, there were large numbers of federal workers who were laid off by the Department of Government Efficiency. You might also remember, though, that Elon Musk and Trump had a partial falling out back in early summer 2025 over the big, beautiful bill. The reason is that Elon Musk joined Doge with the mandate to reduce wasteful government spending and to reduce the US government's national debt by reducing the size of the federal deficit. The big, beautiful bill would do the opposite by increasing the size of the deficit, i.e., increasing spending more than taxes and requiring the US government to borrow trillions of dollars more. That caused a temporary spat between Trump and Musk. Those things have since simmered down, at least moderately. So that's Trump's economic policy, or the kind of core points. In terms of the culture wars, there's a couple of things to know about Trump's policy. One is the shift towards oil and gas production. Trump has been pretty furious about ending Biden's green policies. For example, he largely has moved to end Biden's electric vehicle policies, and through the big, beautiful bill, largely undermine the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the 2022 that Biden and the Democrats passed that included a whole package of subsidies and tax credits for electric vehicles, solar panels, renewable energies, and so forth. Beyond the climate aspects of the climate war, Trump has majorly cracked down on trans rights, in particular on access to gender-affirming care for minors. He's also cracked down massively on immigrant rights, for example, deporting thousands of migrants, many of them without due process, raising a whole bunch of legal challenges. He's also attacked institutions that are perceived as having been infiltrated by the left. So, for example, Trump appointed RFK Jr., who's an open vaccine skeptic, to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. That's a sort of direct effort to instill the sort of culture war attitude towards vaccines into American government. Donald Trump, led largely by Elon Musk, has largely shut down USAID, which provides or has previously provided millions of dollars in life-saving foreign aid abroad. The most famous example being PEPFAR, which was the sort of HIV/AIDS prevention program launched by George W. Bush in the early mid-2000s. Doge also played a role in partially dismantling the Department of Education and going after a range of institutions that were perceived as leftist by the Trump administration. And then in terms of immigration, this is probably where Trump's crackdown has been the swiftest and the harshest. There's been strict border enforcement coupled with mass deportations. Now, it's worth noting that polls show that the overwhelming majority of Americans support deporting migrants with or illegal immigrants with criminal records. The polls are much more split when it comes to deporting immigrants that have no criminal record and have lived in the country for a good period of time. Lots of studies, for example, as well as just kind of general anecdotal evidence, is pretty effective in proving that immigrants have a net positive effect on the United States, particularly in terms of entrepreneurship, job growth, but also just in terms of human flourishing and the ability for immigrants to live good lives in the United States and, for example, evade persecution at home when they might be fleeing war or poverty. Trump has, rather than recognizing those arguments, followed through on most of his promises to engage in mass deportations, including of huge numbers of immigrants who have not committed crimes. The polling on that is a bit complicated. So Trump has lost popularity or lost approval specifically on the issue of immigration, though it still remains one of his comparatively better issues. That being said, the Democratic Party has a major confidence deficit when it comes to immigration. That is to say, although lots of polls now show that people disapprove of Trump's immigration policy more than they approve of it, the Democrats still poll poorly when voters are asked to evaluate their support for the Democrats' ability to handle immigration as a national issue. The other thing to know about Trump's immigration policy is the mass militarization of ICE. This is the body that's more or less tasked with huge numbers of deportations in the United States, rounding up immigrants, sending them to their home countries, etc. And Trump has more or less created a paramilitary force in the form of ICE, coupled with the deployment of the National Guard into American cities. That's been repeatedly challenged in courts. It's worth pointing out that the Supreme Court has been more tolerant of Trump than many people had hoped. That's not to say that the Supreme Court has been a rubber stamp for Donald Trump. For example, there are many acts that Trump has passed that have been struck down by the Supreme Court. Even on the specific example of tariffs, the specific legal authority that Trump has often invoked to justify tariffs has come under question by the Supreme Court recently. But the Supreme Court has largely been more favorable to Trump than many people had hoped. Now, given all of these policy aims, a pretty fair question that lots of people will ask in debate is sort of like, how do we approach and think about Trump psychology? How do we analyze what Trump wants, what Trump values? There's a couple of traditional approaches that you would do for any other politician that don't work as well for Trump. One of them is analyzing what's likely to increase Trump's political popularity. So, for example, you might say, well, Trump has X incentive because Trump wants to boost the popularity of the Republican Party or win elections. The problem is that Trump does lots of things that are explicitly self-sabotaging in that domain. For example, lots of Trump's tariffs are economically backwards in their rationale, but that hasn't stopped Trump from implementing them. Likewise, there are some cases where you would expect Trump to do something on the basis of ideology, but he actually doesn't. So one interesting example of this is abortion. Lots of people have raised lots of concerns about whether Trump would demand that Republicans pass a national abortion ban. It actually turns out that hasn't happened, and Trump has been unexpectedly moderate in the last several years on the abortion issue relative to some of the more Christian nationalist components of the American right-wing movement. So there are cases where, for instance, the Christian nationalist or Christian ideology of the MAGA movement would lead you to believe one thing, like Trump is going to move to ban abortions nationwide, when Trump's behavior actually diverges from that. That being said, there's a couple of ways that I think you can generally approach Trump's psychology. The first is to identify broadly agreed upon facets of Trump's psychology and then explain how they interact with the motion. So, for example, one of the most well-recognized features of Trump's presidency and psychology is that Trump is very transactional, which is to say that Trump really tends to think of lots of things in terms of deals, like what am I getting out of this or what is the United States getting out of this? So, for example, one of the main ways that big tech companies have courted Trump's favor is just to suck up to Trump. So, for example, during the early stages of Trump's presidency, lots of big tech companies, Apple, Google, Amazon, you name it, sent their executives to Trump's inauguration, and they pledged millions of dollars to Trump's reinauguration fund. Likewise, lots of law firms have opted to sign deals with the Trump administration, whereby they'll agree to do pro bono work more or less on behalf of Trump's interests, as long as Trump doesn't crack down on them, like limiting their access to government contracts. And so to that extent, Trump has a fairly transactional mindset. For instance, one of the reasons why Trump is often reluctant to give aid to Ukraine is because it doesn't seem like the United States is getting much out of it. That's why he struck a mineral deal with Ukraine fairly early on in the presidency. Another fairly well-recognized feature of Trumpist psychology is what's called malignant narcissism. This isn't just an insult in the way that you would say, oh, this person's a narcissist. It's an actual mental condition, so to speak. There was a fairly famous ad that was put out by hundreds of psychiatrists back in October 2024 in the New York Times that more or less claimed Trump satisfies most of the key features of malignant narcissists. And the important features of this is the sort of self-centered vision of the world that Trump has, as well as Trump's penchant for aggression and rage against those who defy him, those who are disloyal to him, those who question him, so on and so forth. And so, although there are lots of advisors to Trump, for example, who might try to push Trump in the right direction or encourage Trump to behave in particular ways, it's not always clear that this works particularly well. So, for instance, there has recently been a really interesting set of reports that have come out with interviews with Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff, as well as interviews with a series of other high-ranking officials in the Trump administration. And one of the interesting revelations from those interviews was that when Trump moved to impose his Liberation Day tariffs back in April, there was actually fierce disagreement within the inner circles of the White House about those tariffs. And there were lots of figures, including allegedly J.D. Vance, who were skeptical, in fact, very skeptical of the logic for tariffs and were not supportive, at least not supportive of the specific versions of the tariffs that Trump wanted. But Trump was so single-handedly focused on getting tariffs implemented that he more or less went ahead regardless, despite the objections of very many people of his cabinet. That's one way that you might make arguments about Trump's psychology. You can make arguments about transactionalism, about narcissism, about Trump's ideology, and so forth. The second way that you can make arguments about what Trump is likely to do is to compare whatever policy you're saying Trump is going to do to previous policies that Trump has done. For example, one way that you might make arguments about Trump's foreign policy is to say, look at the trends in Trump's foreign policy and then explain why the policy that you think is likely is consistent with those trends. So, for example, a common argument that you'll hear is that Trump is an isolationist. I think that's an incorrect characterization of Trump's foreign policy. And if you wanted to contest that characterization, you might highlight the many ways in which Trump has actually engaged on the international stage, intervening in Yemen, bombing Iran's nuclear weapons sites, striking narco boats in the Caribbean, and a whole range of other acts of diplomacy whereby Trump has at least attempted to remain fairly involved on the international stage. So you might make arguments about trends in Trump's policies and then say, well, given this history of Trumpist behavior, it's plausible Trump will behave in this way. Of course, one of the issues with this is that Trump is famously inconsistent in the sense that Trump will walk back on things that he himself has done. And so it's not always clear that previous Trump behavior or Trump policy is a accurate or consistent reflection of future trends in Trump policy. The third strategy that is probably persuasive on paper and I think would work somewhat well in debate, but is maybe less true in the real world, is you can analyze the key figures that Trump relies on for input. I've listed here a couple of the key names that you probably want to be familiar with, and you can do a little bit of research on the specific views of each of these people. Some of them are better known than others. So, for example, everyone knows that Pete Navarro is a major advocate of tariffs, and he has pretty substantial influence in Trump's views on trade. RFK Jr. has pretty broad support in the Trump administration for pushing back on what Trump views as the leftist infiltration of the medical establishment. Steve Miller is the sort of border czar of sorts, you might call him, the person who is really hawkish on immigration and has orchestrated and designed much of Trump's immigration crackdown. Susie Wiles is maybe, you could argue, the most powerful person besides Trump in the White House and in the Oval Office. She is her chief of staff. She also previously played a pretty major role in Trump's campaigns down in Florida. And Wiles is widely regarded as one of the most influential figures in the Trump administration, though she doesn't get nearly that much press outside of the current controversy around her. Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State. He's also collected the title of National Security Advisor and somehow I think also Chief Archivist. I'm not quite sure how he got that one. Rubio is an interesting case. Lots of people, myself included, were pretty happy with the Rubio pick. The reason being that Rubio is one of the much more level-headed people on paper in the Trump administration. So just to give a comparison, Pete Hegseth is the guy that runs the Department of Defense that's been renamed the Department of War. Hegseth is, by almost all accounts, ridiculously unqualified for that role. His previous background is mostly as a Fox News host, and Hegseth doesn't really seem fit for the job. Most of his speeches are performative and focus really heavily on culture war issues, but it's not clear that he's a particularly smart strategist on military matters or running the U.S. military. Marco Rubio, by contrast, is pretty widely regarded, including by Democrats. He was confirmed something like 99-0 support. Is pretty widely regarded as a pretty competent figure when it comes to foreign policy and has a pretty cohesive theory of international politics and grand strategy. So, for instance, there were lots of people that thought, well, maybe Marco Rubio can be a sort of voice of reason when it comes to foreign policy. In practice, it seems that Trump has still largely gotten his way, or at least the less rational parts of the Trump administration have still had their way. But Rubio would be an example of perhaps a counter illustration. That being said, there was an interesting point or an interesting piece recently in the New York Times that's maybe worth reading. I'm not quite sure if I agree with the piece, but it's worth reading and engaging with. That sort of makes the case that Marco Rubio has maybe been quietly more successful than people think, in the sense that if you look at Trump's foreign policy, lots of it might actually align more than you'd expect with Rubio's foreign policy in a way that might not be true of other domains of Trump policy aligning with the views of the respective leader of that department or administration post. So, for example, Rubio famously is hawkish on states like Cuba and Venezuela, and for that reason has long been an advocate of harsher sanctions on Venezuela and potentially military action against the Venezuelan regime. He's also been a pretty staunch advocate of a fiercer U.S. foreign policy presence against Iran or Russia, or certainly as well China, though that's probably been an area where the Trump administration's foreign policy has been a disappointment for the Rubioites, so to speak. So the point that I'm making with this third claim here is that one way that you can make arguments about what Trump is likely to do is to say, here are the key sources of influence and input that Trump consults when making decisions, and here's how they're likely to evaluate, for example, the costs and benefits of these different policies. Now, a common clash that's arising, I think, more nowadays in public debates about Trump, and probably will also start to arise in debates about Trump, is whether or not Trump's power is slipping. So if you think back, for instance, to January and February of 2025, Trump really had the upper hand when it came to implementing policy. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was that the Democrats were just reeling from their defeat in the November 2024 election. There was a real lack of leadership, a real lack of direction, and a major sense that the party had lost itself and needed to dramatically rebuild without a clear sense of what that entailed. Another reason was the flood the zone strategy. That's the strategy that Trump has deployed to overwhelm Democrats. The theory is if you throw so many executive orders, so many actions at the wall, it's very difficult for Democrats to respond effectively to all of them. Doge was maybe one of the best examples of this, where Doge and Elon Musk more or less took a chainsaw to USAID in the opening weeks of the Trump administration. And with so much coming at the Democratic Party, at civil society organizations, and so forth, several harmful outcomes occurred. One is that many major institutions opted simply to make deals with the Trump administration as opposed to fight back or publicly oppose Trump's actions. A good example of this is large companies are probably going to suffer under Trump's tariffs, but very many of them have, rather than publicly opposing the tariffs, tried instead to work with the Trump administration for exemptions or to work with the Trump administration for special deals, like NVIDIA's deal, for example, with Trump to sell chips to China and circumvent export restrictions. That's one implication, is that many powerful institutions opted in response to the flood the zone strategy to cut deals with Trump as opposed to publicly resist. And the second implication of the sort of flood the zone strategy more broadly is it made it very difficult for Democrats to effectively use the courts to push back on Trump. One of the reasons for this is just trivially that court orders take time. Courts have to review cases. They need to determine what cases they will and won't hear. Judges issue their opinions. Those get appealed and so forth. And so for many months, really, the Democrats were playing on the back foot. And the other reason, the third reason perhaps, that Trump's power was so dominant in the beginning of the term is that Trump had prepared much more for the second term than he had for the first. It's worth remembering that very few people seriously expected Donald Trump to win the 2016 election. Even lots of people inside Trump's own camp didn't think he was going to win. And as a consequence, although Trump rolled into power in January 2017 with, the presidency backed by Republican power, there wasn't nearly as cohesive a plan for how to use that initial power. By contrast, between Trump's defeat in November 2020 and his return to power in January 2025, there was a mass movement within conservative organizations like the Heritage Foundation, for example, to orchestrate a plan for what to do once Trump was back in power. And so more or less the moment Trump was inaugurated, there was a flurry of executive actions ready to go, executive orders, Doge was ready to slash government spending, cut jobs, so on and so forth. in a way that was very difficult for Democrats to respond to because this was so orchestrated so far in advance. The fourth factor that made Trump really powerful, that I'll talk about much more in a moment, is the Republicans had what might be called an NPC problem. That's the way that Ezra Klein put it, that I think is fairly apt. The NPC problem is basically, although Trump was acting powerfully, he was also acting largely unilaterally, which is to say that Trump was largely infringing on powers that have traditionally been reserved for Congress. A fairly simple example of this would be Trump dismantling or de facto abolishing agencies that were constructed by congressional statutes in a way that means that those agencies really should require congressional authorization to close or to shutter or to attack. Another is what's called impoundment, of Trump sort of exercising greater control over the budgetary process. Now, the theory of power laid out by the founding fathers says when a president tries to reach and grab Congress's power, that shouldn't be a major concern because Congress people should then respond by demanding their own power back. And the reason is because everyone in government is power hungry. They all want power. And so, yeah, the president's going to try to power grab influence away from Congress, but Congress is going to do the same right back to the president. But that didn't happen for the first several weeks and months of the Trump administration, where Congress was in many ways flat in being unwilling to reassert control over domains that have traditionally been considered congressional as opposed to presidential. That being said, things are now potentially, or at least arguably, beginning to change. One reason for this is that Trump's approval has steadily deteriorated. Trump entered with a narrow approval rating above 50%, depending on what polls you look at. It's since deteriorated pretty substantially, particularly in the last several months, and particularly as affordability concerns continue to plague many Americans. It's, by the way, worth noting that Trump is struggling more in terms of his approval than many historic or previous presidents like Biden, even his first term. By the way, if you look at this graph and you're confused what on earth happened with George Bush, remember that that 8-month-in period roughly coincides with September 2001 and the September 11 terror attacks, which saw Bush's approval rating skyrockets. That's a bit of an outlier there. The more important thing to be aware of is that Trump's issue-specific approval rating has deteriorated. By issue-specific, what I mean is that Trump's approval on key issues like his handling of the economy and inflation has been particularly negative. He's also lost ground on what was previously considered one of his best issues, namely immigration. And so that means that there are specific issues that Americans rank very high on their political priority list that they're now disapproving of when it comes to Trump. For example, if you poll Republican voters leaving polls after the 2024 election, very reliably, two of the top things that Republican voters listed as the reasons for voting for Trump were the state of the economy and the state of immigration in the United States. And so if Trump is losing approval on both those issues, that's certainly quite a bad sign for him. So this, for example, is another good illustration of how American attitudes have changed towards Trump when it comes to his handling of immigration, which has seen maybe a sort of modest decline in the past several months, but has seen a real sharp decline in the last sort of 5 to 6 months when it comes to the economy. Why do voters not like Trump's handling of the economy? Well, one very simple reason is just that the economy is not doing that great. So, for example, unemployment has been a real concern for the United States. The United States doesn't have a major labor crisis per se, but difficulties in the labor market are part of the reason why the Federal Reserve is increasingly shifting to lower interest rates as opposed to raise interest rates amidst a environment where inflation remains above the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target. The other thing to remember about inflation is, although inflation has come down pretty dramatically from where it was during the height of the Biden era, so for example, inflation reached 9% at one point under Biden, one of the important problems with inflation is that inflation is about increase in prices. If inflation goes down, that doesn't mean prices go down. It just means that prices go up by less. The issue is that most voters don't feel that way. So one of the arguments that the Democrats repeatedly made during the November 2024 election lead up was inflation has come down and we've got the inflation problem under control. The problem with that argument isn't that it's wrong. The problem is that it doesn't resonate with voters. If you feel like your wages are being eaten up by higher prices, if you feel like you can't afford groceries, gas, housing, etc., the fact that things are not increasing in price by as much is not much consolation. And so the fact that inflation has moderately gone down compared to the worst parts of the Biden era, it still remains somewhere in the ballpark of 2.7 to maybe 3, even a bit upwards of 3%. And overall prices continue to increase. So if you look at polls, for example, there's pretty compelling evidence that lots of people do think that some of their major price inputs, for example, for groceries, have gone up in a way that does mean that Americans are still very much struggling with affordability. Now, one potential question that you might ask is, look, people's attitudes about the economy are not necessarily related very closely with the actual state of the economy. This is what's called a vibe session. The concept is that American attitudes about the economy, so here in green, this is what's called the Consumer Sentiment Index, which basically represents Americans' attitudes about the state of the economy compared to real income, so basically wages adjusted for inflation, essentially. And, in theory, you look at this and you think, well, what on earth is going on here? Because consumer sentiment has historically gone roughly in the same direction as real income, except now in the post-COVID era, things are all over the place. And part of the reason for this is that even though on paper, lots of Americans might be doing better in the sense that their wages have outpaced inflation in terms of wage growth, it doesn't mean that people feel like things are doing better. And major price increases in particularly important goods like healthcare, the cost of higher education, and in particular the cost of housing means that even if people are on paper doing better, it certainly doesn't feel like they're doing better in the post-COVID era, which means very much that voters do care about affordability and inflation, even if wages also happen to be increasing. One of the other problems that doesn't help is that Trump's messaging on economics has been quite poor. Famously, Trump has been moving to reconstruct a part of the White House in a way that's very glitzy and sort of self-congratulatory. Trump authorized what effectively amounted to a $20 billion bailout of Argentina during the government shutdown in a move that was pretty outrageous to very many Americans who were dissatisfied with the state of the U.S. economy. Trump has had this sort of weird line at one point of claiming that the concept of affordability is a hoax. That's probably not a message that's going to sell very well with voters. Of course, that being said, Trump's messaging probably doesn't have a major effect at this point on his popularity. One reason for this is just that Trump has been pretty consistently one of the major facets of American politics, more or less since Trump came down the golden escalator back in June of 2015. And for that reason, Trump has, and all of his nasty rhetoric's been so exposed to the American public, think the Access Hollywood tape, for example, that very many Americans have just made up their mind when it comes to Trump's rhetoric. And there's perhaps a diminishing marginal returns effect of just how much worse rhetoric is going to change people's minds. The other reason why messaging from Trump might not majorly change people's views of Trump is just that media consumption is quite polarized in the age of cable news and also in the age of social media. For example, if you're a Republican, good chance you watch Fox. If you're a Democrat, good chance you watch CNN or MSNBC. And so there's a bit of a selection bias in terms of what messages people actually end up being exposed to. So the TLDR here, the economy is not in a great position. Americans are very concerned about the cost of living, and Trump is suffering in the polls as a consequence. So that's the first factor counting against Trump, which is the general deterioration in popular support for his administration. The second trend to be aware of is the string of defeats that Republicans have suffered in the 2025 elections. So there were a handful of important elections held in 2025. For example, the governorships in Virginia and New Jersey were both won by double digits by Democrats in races that could theoretically have been closer. Zohran Mamdani, we'll talk about later, won in New York City's race for mayor. And even in races where the Republican Party won, for example, the special elections in Florida and Tennessee, the margins were unusually close, which suggests that Democrats are regaining ground that they lost in 2024. And there's also specific examples you could point to of this. So, for example, Miami hasn't had a Democratic mayor in something like 30 years, and that's very recently changed. And what that sort of suggests is that lots of the groups that Democrats struggled with in 2024, young voters, voters of color, et cetera, some of those voters voters started coming back to the Democratic Party. Now, as I mentioned before, this doesn't guarantee that Democrats are going to see similar results in 26 or 28. Part of the reason for that is that voter turnout tends to be lower in off-year election cycles. And one of the issues that Democrats faced in 2024 is that irregular voters, voters who don't vote frequently and especially don't vote in off-year elections, tended to shift more towards Trump than towards Harris. So Democrats' ability to win low engagement voters is probably something that remains untested after 2025. One of the key questions that you might ask is, okay, well, Trump seems unpopular, and we know that there's some evidence for this, which is that his party took a beating in the 2025 elections. What does this say about the 2026 midterm elections? Well, if you look at polls right now, national polls are showing something like a 4 to maybe 2 point edge for the Democrats in sort of national polls. Now, that doesn't mean that Democrats are going to necessarily win back the House or the Senate. The Senate will be a much harder bid for the Democrats to win back in 2026, just based on the specific states that happen to be up for grabs, and many of them being places that are going to be a bit tougher for Democrats to win. Right now, the Democrats probably have better odds than not of recapturing the House, especially given that they have a sort of national edge over the Republicans. That being said, it's worth remembering that when the Democrats had a blowout set of wins in the 2018 midterm elections, they were polling much better nationwide circa December 2017. So in other words, the year before the elections, where they were consistently polling somewhere in the ballpark of 10 to even 15 points ahead of the Republicans. Today, that's more in the ballpark of 2 to 4 points ahead of the Republicans. By the way, this is a cool graph that visually shows what happens to the House of Representatives in the midterm elections. To be clear, the midterm elections are the elections that occur in the middle of the president's term. So for Biden, that was 2022. For Trump 1, that was 2018. For Obama, that was 2010 and 2014. And for Trump now, that will be in 2026. And you'll notice that the general trend is that if you are an incumbent president and you have midterm elections with an unpopular approval rating, your party typically tends to see a loss of seats in a way that can be fairly bad for your party. So, for example, Obama back in 2010, the Democrats saw real catastrophic losses in the midterm elections, even though Obama happened to have a approval rating a year prior that was actually pretty solid, at least by modern standards. So that's the second issue facing Trump, which is the loss of Republicans in the 2025 elections. The third major issue that's worth flagging that Trump faces is that Republicans are increasingly rebelling against Trump. And probably the most famous example of this recently is Trump's stance on the Epstein files. I'll talk a bit more about the details of the Epstein files in a second. But the TLDR of what you should know is that Trump, after assuming the presidency, abandoned much of his previous rhetoric about releasing the Epstein files. That angered very many Republicans, Thomas Massie, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And Trump was pretty defiant. This was a Democratic hoax. This is not something that Republicans should be talking about. It's a waste of our time. But Republicans did not follow Trump's lead. And ultimately, when the vote came to vote on the Epstein files, nearly all Republicans agreed to release those files. And just prior to that vote happening, Trump finally capitulated and basically shifted stances entirely and said, yes, you should vote to release the Epstein files. Now, was this Trump having a profound change of heart and coming to his senses? Probably not. More likely, it reflected the fact that Trump realized that he really had lost full control of the Republican Party on this specific issue. So if you haven't followed the Epstein files story closely, what you sort of just need to know, Jeffrey Epstein, very powerful, wealthy, influential figure who was a child sex trafficker. He received a very generous plea deal back in the early mid-2000s, around 2008. He was later reinvestigated and then imprisoned. He then died in prison under quasi-mysterious circumstances. It was ruled a suicide. Lots of people think he didn't kill himself and he was potentially killed based on what he knew. Now, the reason why people care a lot about this is because during these investigations, national and federal law enforcement agencies compiled pretty extensive files on Epstein and the crimes alleged against him, as well as pictures. And this created a huge, sprawling conspiracy theory about the people that Epstein was affiliated with, who else was involved in the child sex trafficking, whether or not powerful people orchestrated Epstein's murder, so on and so forth. And this gained lots of prominence in the lead up to the 2024 election. For example, even just prior to Trump assuming office in January of 2025, the fairly influential tech figure Peter Thiel wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times that spoke of this quote unquote distributed idea suppression complex that was preventing the release of more information about the Epstein files. Now, why have Republicans cared so much about the Epstein files? Well, there is one part of it, which is that there are portions of the Republican base that might legitimately just be deeply angered by Epstein's abuses. And there is certainly some truth to that. But there's also a deeper dimension about the nature of power and suspicion of institutions. So MAGA has very many conspiratorial flanks. There are conspiracies about the Democrats. Think, for example, the claim that the Democrats rigged the 2020 election. There are conspiracies about the deep state, conspiracies about Israel, conspiracies about entrenched corporate interests and billionaires and so forth. And for the parts of the MAGA movement that endorse conspiratorial thinking, the Epstein files and the Epstein scandal is this major, major central piece of the puzzle in the sense that if you believe that there is a deep state that is running American society, controlling American enterprises, pulling the strings of American government, controlling our lives, our algorithms, our choices, and so forth, well, there is really a very powerful connection to be made between that conspiracy and Epstein, because Epstein has these billionaire friends who are running the world and controlling global governance, and all the while they're all pedophiles and child sex traffickers who are sneaking away to Epstein's private island and sexually assaulting children. And to that extent, there is a conspiratorial dimension that says there is this cabal of elites out there that wants to keep us in the dark. And Donald Trump is going to shatter that cabal of elites and is going to uncover the skeletons in the closet. And so Trump openly tapped into that. J.D. Vance very explicitly was asked, will you release the Epstein files? And the answer was yes, we have to release the Epstein files. And so when Trump gained power and suddenly refused to release the Epstein files, this wasn't a matter of just, Trump betraying a campaign promise. He's done that plenty of times before. This was more fundamentally a matter of a deep-seated conspiracy that suddenly looked like it could involve people in the Trump administration. Think Pam Bondi, who runs the Department of Justice, refusing, stonewalling repeatedly efforts to release the Epstein files. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had historically been a major backer of Donald Trump and one of the most hard-right voices in the culture war faction of the Republican Party, ultimately split from the Republican Party, announced her resignation, and had a major public fight with Trump specifically over the Epstein files. So the Epstein files are sort of evidence of Republicans' increasing willingness to break from Trump on issues where the MAGA base really does view things as deeper or more important than Trump and his cult of personality. The other related rebuke that Trump has faced, and some people are pretty seriously calling this the most powerful attack on Trump from the Republican Party, is what happened in Indiana. So a bit of context. Redistricting is when a state legislature redraws political boundaries, typically with the aim to increase that party's share of votes or representatives in the U.S. House in upcoming elections. So the way that you can do this, it's sort of gerrymandering, that's what it's called. You can redraw where the boundaries are located to make your party have an artificial advantage. So you make the, opposing political party be the political minority in each district, or you pack all of their support into just one district, and then you give yourself a bunch of safe seats that your party is very likely to win. It's a bit of a misnomer that this is a Republican thing. Democrats gerrymander, Republicans gerrymander. It's a pretty time-tested tradition in American politics, even though there has been a general shift, for example, away from racialized gerrymandering due to SCOTUS precedent, as well as a general shift in some states previously, like California, towards nonpartisan redistricting. Uh, the redistricting arms race is what's happened in 2025, where there's been a major push by the Republican Party and then in response to the Democratic Party to explicitly redraw state level political boundary maps in order to advantage the Republican or respectively Democratic parties in the 26 midterms. This began in Texas, where the Texas Republicans passed a new or a redistricting plan that would basically give Republicans something like five-ish more expected seats. The Democrats were split in response to this. So there's two ways that you might think about this. One is the sort of Obama theory of when they take the low road, we take the high road, right? The Republicans will play dirty, but we're going to play by the rules and practice respect and decency. There's a different point of view that Gavin Newsom has really embodied. He's the governor of California. And the Newsom approach is more along the lines of, if we want to seriously challenge Trump and prevent Trump from winning the 26 midterms, we need to play dirty and more or less do in response to the Republicans what the Republicans are doing to us. So Gavin Newsom in California supported what was called Proposition 50, which was basically then put up to the Californian people for a vote. It was called the quote unquote Election Rigging Response Act that more or less inverted Texas's effort. The logic is if you redistrict California to give the Democrats more seats, well, then that counterbalances what the Republicans and Greg Abbott have done over in Texas. And then this has been done in many other states, Ohio, Missouri, North Carolina, Virginia. And so this is sort of an ongoing arms race of Republicans districting and then Democrats responding in tandem. There are some concerns that the redistricting arms race will potentially just give no one an advantage, like Republicans will gain 5 seats here, Democrats will gain 5 seats here. There are some people who are worried, though, that Democrats are poised to lose the redistricting arms race for one of two reasons. One is just the GOP holds more state legislatures than the Democrats, so just kind of trivially, if the redistricting arms race goes national, the Republicans have the edge. The other reason is that Republicans are probably more willing to circumvent traditional Democratic and liberal protocols in order to gain power in comparison to the Democrats. And that potentially means that the Democrats face a sort of liberal constraint, an ideological constraint on their willingness to engage in sort of dirty politics, if that means challenging the Republicans and reducing the ability of the Republicans to win in 26. Now, the relevance of Indiana here is that Trump has lots of power over Republicans. There's lots of reasons for that. He has a cult of personality. Trump has repeatedly threatened to oust Republicans who oppose him. The specific way that Trump would threaten to do this is to back primary campaigns against Republicans. So in the United States, there are two types of elections, primary and general. Primary elections are intra-party elections to determine which candidate will receive a party's nomination to run in the general. And then the general election is the election between the Republicans and Democrats and any third-party candidates. Trump has repeatedly threatened, as has Elon Musk with all of the money he has, to basically primary away Republicans who challenge him in a way that basically means even Republicans in very safe seat districts where the Democrats are guaranteed to lose are at risk of losing power if they irk Trump. And of course, there's another problem for Republicans, which is just a collective action problem. If you're the one Republican that speaks out and every other Republican has sort of bent the knee to Trump, then all the other Republicans are going to turn on you. The relevance of all this to Indiana is that Trump repeatedly encouraged Indiana Republicans to engage in this redistricting arms race. And eventually the Indiana Senate rejected Trump's effort. They moved against him. They refused to do so on ideological and on political grounds. And what that represents is a sort of backbone of some state level Republicans to stand up to Trump, but also B, Given the many problems that Trump faces in terms of his brand and his association with cost of living, lots of Republicans might increasingly have to shift away from Trump in order to distance themselves from an unpopular White House in a way that means that the initial subservience of the early Trump administration, so January through March perhaps, might start to fade, and you'll see more and more Republicans speaking out against Trump. Another example of this I didn't put in the slides is Pete Hegseth, the guy who runs the Department of Defense, has come under scrutiny for alleged war crimes committed during the U.S. Airstrikes against alleged narco boats in the Caribbean. The specific strike that's being called a war strike or a war crime is what's called a double tap strike. The way a double tap works is the rules of law. Sorry, I said that wrong. The laws of war are pretty clear that if you, for example, bomb a boat and then there are survivors clinging onto the boat, you can't bomb the boat again. Those are helpless individuals. They're casualties that are should therefore be treated as prisoners of war, not as legitimate combatants. And there's a concern that kill everyone orders issued by Hegseth are pretty clear war crimes. And you've even now had some Republicans demand oversight of Hegseth's actions and have called for congressional inquiries. And even that is a pretty substantial rhetorical shift in the Republican Party. While we're talking broadly about redistricting, I figured that this would be a sort of good time just to comment quickly on Trumpism and democracy. So this is a common argument that you'll hear in public discourse and even in debate. And the argument is basically Trump is turning the United States into an authoritarian fascist hellscape. There's not going to be free and fair elections and so forth. And there's some merit to these arguments, of course. I'm not denying that. The point I'm making here is that if you want to execute that argument in a debate, you should have concrete illustrations and mechanisms to justify the claim that Trump is autocratizing American governance. And there are lots of examples that you can go after. The fact that Trump is targeting political enemies through the Department of Justice, James Comey, Letitia Jones, John Bolton, all would be simple examples of that. Pardoning many of the people who were involved in the January 6th riots, coercing law firms like Paul Weiss into sort of doing Trump's dirty work through pro bono law and threatening them with punishments if they don't. Another are the many ways in which Trump has undermined checks and balances by ignoring court orders and usurping congressional authority, restricting free speech, often in potential violation of the First Amendment. Simple examples of this, one of the most famous examples of this that you might be familiar with is the Jimmy Kimmel issue. For context, Jimmy Kimmel is a political commentator and comedian of sorts. After Charlie Kirk's assassination in September 2025, Kimmel made a series of remarks that some people found offensive or harmful. Kimmel subsequently was basically threatened and pulled off the air by the Federal the Federal Communications agency, or the FCC as it's called. And the way that this worked basically was that the head of the FCC had this famous interview where he basically said, Kimmel has to walk back these comments. This is unacceptable. And we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way, was the way he put it, making it pretty clear that it's more or less a matter of if Kimmel has said these things as he had, then the response is that the U.S. government will intervene to prevent Kimmel from having a national platform by suspending broadcast licenses for stations that air his show. And there's other manifestations of the crackdown on free speech, like cracking down on private universities and demanding that they make changes to who they hire and fire and the courses that they teach. There's been a criminal investigation into lots of high-profile Democratic senators, one against Mark Kelly from Arizona, who issued a tweet alongside several other Democrats reminding soldiers that they are not that they are obligated to refuse to follow illegal orders. There have been a series of major lawsuits launched by Trump against large media corporations, including the New York Times, ABC, CBS, and lots of people also just point generally to the expansion of the security apparatus, particularly ICE under Trump, as a potential threat to American security and a way for Trump to consolidate power. One potential question that you might ask is, what is the outcome of Trump's attack on liberal democracy? One extreme end is you get January 6th, but successful. In other words, you get Trump outright staging a coup against the American government and rigging elections. That is possible, though it's worth noting that most countries that descend into authoritarianism don't see that version of authoritarianism, like a sudden violent coup that seizes power. The more common transfer to authoritarianism is what might be called competitive authoritarianism. That's what you might see more commonly in a place like Turkey for some period in time, maybe India, even to some extent in a place like Venezuela, arguably, or maybe in a place like Hungary, for instance, although Hungary is probably more on the democratic end of the spectrum compared to some of those other examples. But competitive authoritarianism is basically this system where you have elections, but the playing field isn't fair. Whoever is in power right now has asymmetric advantages that makes it difficult for the opposing political movements to succeed. So a very simple example of what this might look like is Act Blue is one of the large organizations involved in democratic fundraising, and there's now a criminal investigation pending into Act Blue. That's a pretty naked example of Trump trying to tilt the playing field in his favor. If you make it harder for Democrats to donate, if you make people scared of donating, if you make people scared of protesting because they're worried about ICE or the National Guard showing up, etc., well, then it becomes harder and harder to protest the use of power by the Trump administration. It might not result in elections being outright rigged, though there are very much concerns about that. Remember, Trump literally tried to overturn the 2020 election, and there have already been a series of efforts by Trump to restrict voting access or potentially station soldiers as a way to maybe intimidate voters in the 26 elections or the 28 presidential race. But the more likely outcome here, as opposed to a outright capture of democracy by authoritarianism, is a descent into imbalanced democracy, or what you might call competitive authoritarianism. One of the key variables that will determine the degree to which the United States does or doesn't retain its democratic character is the degree to which the Supreme Court will act as a check on Trump. Of course, there is currently a 6-3 conservative split on the Supreme Court, and many conservative justices have shown pretty substantial tolerance for Trump thus far, with a handful of notable exceptions. And so there are some concerns that the Supreme Court won't really act as a sufficient check. By the way, I just think it's worth remembering the distinction between liberalism and democracy when making arguments here. Lots of people conflate the two, and that's kind of understandable. So, for example, a common phrase you'll hear in debate is liberal democracy, and implicitly these two things are assumed to be the same. They are, of course, slightly distinct concepts. Democracy is a government form based around popular sovereignty, the idea that you have elections to determine who is in power. Liberalism is an ideology focused on liberty and the concept of rights and restriction of government power. The reason why that distinction is relevant is that oftentimes people might make arguments that say Trump's attacks on democracy are unpopular, and so therefore the Democratic Party should really emphasize this in their attacks on Trump. And there's some merit to that claim, but one of the problems is that much of what Trump is going after is not democracy per se, it's liberalism. So, for example, when Trump attacks the independence of the Federal Reserve, as he has repeatedly done, he's not really attacking democracy. I mean, indirectly he is. He's attacking a system that was democratically instituted. But the Federal Reserve itself is not a democratic institution. So if you frame that as an attack on democracy, well, what you're really saying is there's a system of government, a system of liberal democracy that exists to promote prosperity and well-being of the American people. And by attacking the independence of the Federal Reserve, Trump is undermining that system in a way that will make your life worse. But one of the issues that Democrats will face is that there are lots of things that Trump has done and will continue to do that are attacks on liberalism, but not necessarily attacks on democracy. So although it is true that most Americans still very much support the concept of democracies, they still very much see democracy as good and as worthy of defense, the specific way that Trump is undermining democracy, with the notable exception of November 2020 and Trump's rhetoric vis-a-vis election fraud, much of what Trump is doing is undermining liberalism. That creates a messaging problem for Democrats, because Democrats will have an easier time convincing people that democracy is important than convincing people that upholding a system of procedural checks and norms is important, especially if implicitly the Democrats then become the status quo party, the party that wants to maintain the government as is. That works fine when people are satisfied with the status quo. It doesn't work so well when people are dissatisfied with the way things are and want to see change. And so that creates a bit of a messaging problem for Democrats. On the topic of liberalism and democracy, a question that shows up quite a bit in popular discourse is whether or not Trump is a fascist. The context that might be useful is when people say, is Trump a fascist? I think they often implicitly assume that there is a sort of clear or well-defined definition of fascism. And as a consequence, you sort of just need to like figure out whether or not Trump satisfies that definition. In reality, it's often much harder to figure out what fascism is. And I don't just mean this is like a technical academic point, like, oh, well, it's hard to define fascism. I mean more broadly, like the claim that Trump is fascist is largely reliant on, well, how do you specifically define or characterize fascism? But regardless of how you specifically define fascism, there's a couple of features of fascism that are pretty common across fascist regimes. Think Italy, think Germany, et cetera, in the 1930s. And three of them are what you might call palingenetic nationalism, the sort of politics of aesthetics, and militarized totalitarianism. Um, the way that I personally think of fascism as a combination of these three is that fascism is less of a clearly defined political ideology as it is a world-shaping project. What I mean by that is like, if you think about major political ideologies like liberalism or conservatism, these are coherent intellectual traditions with arguments in their favor and clear explications of what they stand for. Fascism really isn't that. It's more of just a project that aims to use power and violence to cleanse the nation of groups that do not satisfy an ethno-nationalist definition of identity, like racial minorities, as well as to expand the nation through conquer, through war, through invasion. And so there are kind of three of these core features then of fascism that you could sort of say. Robert Paxton's book, by the way, Anatomy of Fascism, is a really good and timely read, even though it's a historical book that's not directly about Trump. Palingenesis is the concept of rebirth. And the concept of palingenetic nationalism is the idea that fascists typically don't just embrace ultranationalism, which is of course true. They embrace a very specific form of nationalism that says, our nation is in decline. It has been captured by a corrupt oligarchy, and we need to remake our nation new again. And that is sort of verbatim what Make America Great Again is. That is literally the point of MAGA. The other 2 points are about spectacle and militarism. The concept of aestheticized politics is that politics becomes a spectacle. The idea that you turn people's anger and frustration and rage into not just a set of policy proposals like, well, you are angry about inflation, so we're going to implement XYZ policies to deal with inflation. The concept of politics as an aesthetic performance is that you turn people's rage and anger itself into a political spectacle. That what it means to be in government is to channel that sense of rage and anger and anti-establishmentarianism into your political values. And the concept of militarized totalitarianism basically means using military force and state coercion to control all aspects of both public life, so things like public speech, or organizations like NGOs and civil society organizations and corporations, but also private life, for example, what people think, what people say, and so forth. And so there are dimensions on which Trumpism satisfies all three conditions. Of course, this is more of an intellectual exercise, perhaps, than anything else, but it does have bearing on Democratic messaging debates. There are lots of Democrats, for instance, who debate the merits of calling Trump a fascist versus as not. The next thing that I'll talk about is factionalism in MAGA and the competing groups that seek influence within the MAGA movement across the board. This here is a pretty nice visual representation of a couple of different factions of the MAGA movement, sort of categorized by their stances on a range of economic issues, like their attitude towards redistribution, and also their stance on immigration issues, like their tolerance for giving permanent resident status to dreamers, as they're called, i.e. a specific subset of immigrants, i.e., for example, children born in the United States. There's many different ways that you can define and categorize who is in MAGA. So like, for example, this here is the Economist's characterization, where you can sort of think of the MAGA movement as having a group of economic populists, a group of more moderate Republicans, neoconservatives, isolationists, culture warriors. It's worth pointing out that all of these factions overlap to varying degrees. Like you can be a culture warrior and an economic populist. You really can't be much of an isolationist and a neoconservative for reasons I'll explain in a second, but there's lots of overlap between these. These are general ways of categorizing broad ideological currents within the Make America Great Again movement. So there's a group of economic populists. J.D. Vance is often lumped into that camp, though it's contestable whether that's the best place to put him. These are the people who generally favor a more economic approach towards politics, a focus on redistribution, sometimes a focus on sort of anti-oligarchy or anti-corporate rhetoric. And there's components of that. Like, for example, Trump will often talk negatively about insurance companies as being greedy or exploitative and taking on big insurance, stuff like that. But economic populists broadly are much more focused on working class concerns. Remember, one of the ways that J.D. Vance broke into the national conscience was by writing a book, more or less about the struggles of working class communities in the United States and the economic challenges they face in the age of deindustrialization and globalization. And so these are the groups that are often more skeptical of free trade, more skeptical sometimes of large corporations, more supportive in general for redistributive programs that aim to give more wealth towards working class families, etc. There's a wide range of views on foreign policy in the MAGA movement. The probably two endpoints are the neocons and the isolationists. So isolationists, Rand Paul is sort of the figurehead of this group, are the group that are much, much, much more reluctant for the United States to become involved in foreign military conflicts and become entangled in forever wars. They're very skeptical, for example, of the U.S. military operations against Venezuela, against the U.S. involvement in Yemen, against the Houthis, and in Iran against the nuclear weapons programs. Neocons or neoconservatives fit on sort of the opposite end of that spectrum. The sort of figurehead of that today might be a person more akin to Lindsey Graham. These are people who are much more supportive of the use of military force and military power abroad. They often support aid to Ukraine, whereas isolationists are pretty fiercely skeptical of that. There are a range of viewpoints within the neoconservative movement about where American military power should be allocated and where it should be concentrated. For example, there are some factions of the neocon movement that say China is the main threat and should be the primary focus of U.S. foreign policy. Other groups focus more on Russia. So there's a wide range within the neoconservative movement, but there's a pretty broad array of foreign policy views. There are specific views on Israel that I'll talk about in a second that become a bit divergent. There's another faction of the MAGA slash conservative movement that's much more explicitly Christian nationalist. J.D. Vance probably does fit in there to some extent. If you ever listen to J.D. Vance's speeches or read some of his writings, there is very much an explicit and overtly Christian dimension to them, or religious dimension to it. For example, if you read the recent national security strategy that the United States published, it's pretty clear that large sections of it were heavily influenced by the sort of Christian nationalist branch of the MAGA movement. Mike Johnson might be named as a kind of component of the Christian right as one example, a person who blends faith and politics pretty consistently. The Christian right is the component of MAGA that's more focused on infusing religion with politics. So, for example, this tends to be the faction of MAGA that's a bit more hardline when it comes to abortion and reducing access to abortion and cracking down on reproductive rights. This is also the faction that tends to have a much greater emphasis on religious messaging. For example, Trump has often incorporated religious messages into his politics and campaigning, particularly in the aftermath of the July 2024 assassination attempt, where he often will now frame himself in sort of quasi-spiritual terms as having been saved to serve a higher purpose, so to speak. And Trump himself has often talked about the desire to get into heaven and what that might take. There's a pretty major divide within the Republican Party over tech. So on one end of the spectrum, you have folks like Steve Bannon, who are pretty fiercely skeptical of big tech and have been skeptical of big tech for many years. They view it as excessive corporate power. They're skeptical of social media and so forth. There's another component of the MAGA movement that's led by big tech. Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, is probably the figurehead of this movement. You could also arguably characterize Elon Musk as the figurehead, though his fallout with Trump after the big, beautiful bill might complicate that story a bit. The tech right features lots of large tech companies that have sort of gotten in bed with MAGA and accepted some of Trump's crazier impulses if it means that they can strike or cut deals with Trump to permit, for example, the sale of US chips abroad or exemptions from tariffs on China, that sort of stuff. And then there's a component of the MAGA movement that's just much more moderate and much more traditionally conservative, which is to say, less enamored with extremism, less enamored with the culture wars, more focused on pocketbook issues, economic affordability, general opposition towards the most hardline versions of MAGAism, etc. That being said, there are lots of major divisions within the conservative movement. I'm going to highlight a couple of the important ones and spend most of the time talking about the Israel/Nick Fuentes dispute. There's one dispute over high skill immigration. So over here on the right is Stephen Miller. He's the architect of much of Trump's border and immigration policy. And on the left is a fairly famous tweet now from Vivek Ramaswamy, who launched a failed presidential bid in the 2024 primaries for the Republican Party. So there is pretty much near unanimous opposition to low skill immigration amongst Republicans. Very few Republicans in the MAGA movement are super supportive, for example, of low skill migrants, and certainly not undocumented immigration. But there's a split within the Republican movement over high skill immigration, like the H-1B visa program, which permits well-trained, well-educated workers from abroad to come to the United States to work in high-demand sectors like tech, healthcare, etc. And so there are large parts of the MAGA movement that oppose the H-1B program. They view it as stealing American jobs. And there is just a lot of blatant anti-Indian racism in opposition to the H-1B visa program, given that most H-1B visas go to Indian nationals. There is another faction of the MAGA movement that's much more enamored with programs like H-1B. Part of this is an economic reason. For example, if you're a tech billionaire, you benefit a lot from H-1B visas because you rely on them for lots of your skilled workers. There's also reasons more broadly, though, about just using immigration in a positive way, as opposed to having a totalizing opposition to immigration in any form. That's sort of what the Ramaswamy tweet, controversial as it is, sort of ends up getting at. There are benefits to immigration. I sort of talked earlier about the Epstein controversy, but the kind of key takeaway to keep in mind here is that figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene really did push Trump towards the release of the Epstein files, and the dispute between Marjorie Taylor Greene in particular and Donald Trump became so intense that MTG actually ended up leaving the party and leaving the government wholesale. Whether she'll leave Republicanism is a bit unclear. It seems very unlikely that she ever goes Democrat, but the relationship with the Republican Party has certainly been quite fragmented. But really, the most important dispute, without really, I think, much debate going on in the Republican Party today, is the dispute over, in a narrow sense, Nick Fuentes and the Groypers. In a much broader sense, is a broader disagreement about the future of the Republican Party, who succeeds Donald Trump after his inevitable departure from politics, and specifically Israel. So this debate involves a series of figures. You should probably start to know these names if you want to be able to debate about MAGA effectively. So the ones to sort of keep in mind are Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, and the political activist who was assassinated. Nick Fuentes is the far-right, anti-Semitic, Holocaust denying, racist, sexist political commentator. Tucker Carlson is maybe the most influential conservative media host in the United States, having left Fox News and now runs his own show. Ben Shapiro is the fairly famous conservative commentator, Facts and Logic, that sort of stuff. The Heritage Foundation is one of the largest conservative think tanks in the United States and played a particularly major role in the production of a series of documents that were pretty central to Trump's initial path to power, in the sense of Trump's policy outline and scaffolded executive orders. So the Heritage Foundation has played a pretty major role as one of the sort of ideological backbones, so to speak, of the modern conservative movement. Candace Owens is another conservative media figure who has become much more conspiratorial in the last several years, especially in the last 1 to 2 years. She's got loads of conspiracy theories about Emmanuel Macron's wife, loads of conspiracy theories about Israel's involvement in Charlie Kirk's murder, even Erica Kirk, which is his wife, her involvement in the murder. And these figures kind of all come together in a slightly confusing way. So, for context, Charlie Kirk founded and led Turning Point USA. At its base, Turning Point USA is a collection of conservative clubs across university campuses. The idea is these are places where conservative students congregate and sort of challenge the liberal bastion that dominates university culture. They invite speakers, etc. And Kirk was very famous for going across campuses and debating leftists and liberals who disagreed with him, etc. Now, Kirk was killed. He was assassinated at an event in Utah in September of 2025. His assassination was important perhaps for two reasons with respect to the Republican divide, maybe a third actually. One reason is that Kirk's assassination immediately fueled right-wing rhetoric about leftist violence in the United States. There were immediate calls to crack down on leftist organizations, investigate the terrorist links of major leftist donors like George Soros, etc. The second implication is a immediate increase, after this kind of unity around his death passed, a real increase in disagreement and division in the Republican Party. And and that's not to say like prior to Kirk's assassination, the Republicans were unified. Like the Epstein stuff, for example, very much developed prior to Kirk's assassination. But one of the important roles that Kirk served in the Republican movement, beyond just mobilizing the youth vote, which is largely what Turning Point USA did, one of the more important roles that he played, sort of privately, was more or less as a mediator of different factions of the conservative movement. And the reason is that Kirk had relations with very many people who represented very many ideological strands of the MAGA movement. And he was pretty effective at sort of just behind the scenes mediation between lots of people who otherwise would fight in public and, texting, phone calls, that sort of stuff. He can be pretty effective at mediating some of those disputes. When Kirk was killed, that role was sort of left unfilled, and as a consequence, division started to arise. But really, the third critical step that arose was the rise of Nick Fuentes. So, for context, Fuentes, he's a former BU student. He's been running a media program for many years. He played a fairly pronounced role back in the 2017 Unite the Right white nationalist rally in Charlottesville. He is a pretty unabashed white supremacist. He's an open misogynist. He's a nasty human being, really. There's not many redeeming traits about this guy. And the controversial starting point for the MAGA dispute, the most intense one recently of late, was Tucker Carlson, who runs what is probably one of the largest, maybe arguably the largest conservative media movements in the United States, interviewed Nick Fuentes. On its own, that's alarming because Fuentes is a highly problematic speaker. The part that really frustrated people on the right in particular was that Carlson gave Fuentes an extreme softball interview in the sense that Carlson did very little to push back on Fuentes' more extremist views and harmful views. For example, there's one point in the interview where Fuentes openly expresses admiration for Stalin and Tucker Carlson just lets it pass, which is a bit unexpected and certainly odd. And the important sort of third rail that gets touched with this Fuentes interview is by interviewing Fuentes, who is an avowed anti-Semite who hates Jews. Carlson basically opens up or sort of further unveils a huge amount of disagreement in the Republican Party over Israel. So what ends up happening, I guess I'll start with this actually. So there's a broader trend, which is that the U.S. and Israel have historically been close allies, and the Republican Party in particular has historically had very close connections with the Israeli government. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is geopolitical, like the U.S.-Israel alliance. Some of it is religious. For example, there are lots of evangelical Christians who have a very deeply held conviction of the spiritual importance of upholding the state of Israel. Some of it is the influence of AIPAC, which is the major lobbying organization that petitions for close U.S.-Israel relations. That has historically meant that attitudes in the United States towards Israel are predominantly favorable. That has changed pretty markedly since the war in Gaza began back in October 2023, in the sense that if you poll voters generally, but especially Republicans and especially young Republicans, for example, Republicans under the age of 50, there's been a real dramatic rise in anti-Israel views. Now, the shift in attitudes towards Israel itself is not really the main driving divide in the right. The real issue is that basically there are two components of the rise of anti-Israel views on the right. First, there are completely legitimate criticisms of Israeli policy, for example, the genocide in Gaza, as well as criticisms of the US's support and level of support for Israel. So, for instance, a pretty common argument you'll hear amongst conservative commentators is that the United States has sort of sold itself out to Israel in the sense that the United States lets Israel dictate US foreign policy when it comes to Israel as opposed to the other way around. And those are reasonable arguments that can be debated and discussed. The second component of the rise of anti-Israel views in the US conservative movement is just actual outright anti-Semitism. So, for example, Nick Fuentes, who leads the quote-unquote Groyper movement, that's what his followers are called, Groyper, like Nick Fuentes openly admires Hitler, openly questions and denies the Holocaust. Like there, it's not even like an attempt at hiding anti-Semitism. It's pretty blatant and pretty out in the open. And so as a consequence, there's this major civil war now between competing factions of the conservative movement. On the one end, you have figures who either are pretty openly conspiratorial. So Candace Owens, for example, has said some pretty wild things about Israel's alleged involvement in the assassination of Charlie Kirk. The conspiracies are largely baseless, but have gained quite a bit of traction. And there's also lots of more traditional voices on the right, folks, for example, like Ted Cruz, who are pretty skeptical of Tucker Carlson interviewing an avowed anti-Semite. Ben Shapiro has probably played the most pronounced role in the attack on not only Nick Fuentes, but also on Tucker Carlson for platforming him. So Shapiro has pretty explicitly denounced Carlson for his association with Fuentes. The other specific domain that makes this relevant to Kirk is that Kirk was wildly oppositional to Nick Fuentes. Famously, Turning Point USA would sometimes refuse to hire people who had taken pictures with Fuentes. That was how deep the rivalry ran. And Nick Fuentes was openly, brutally hostile towards Charlie Kirk, even after his death. That remains to this day. So there's this major division on the right that is, in theory, just about Nick Fuentes, but is more broadly about disagreements about the conservative movement's attitude towards anti-Semitism, and also more broadly the conservative movement's attitude towards Israel and U.S. foreign policy, the debate between isolationists and neocons, stuff like that. The end takeaway is that the MAGA civil war, if you want to call it that, is certainly on the rise. So that's the Republican side of affairs, what Republicans under Trump care about, Trump's waning power, where the Republican movement potentially goes from here. Now we'll pivot towards talking about Democrats. So if you think that Republicans have a lot of factions, the Democrats are probably ahead even on that metric. I'll just note, by the way, that there is no consensus on how to name or characterize these factions. There are loads of different attempts to do so. You can probably find 8 or 9 different ways of factionalizing the Democratic Party and naming the different groups. This is just a rough breakdown. And I'll emphasize, as I've written here, that there's lots of overlap. So, for example, you can be progressive on social issues and also populist on economic issues. You can be populist on economic issues, but fairly moderate when it comes to social issues. So there's a couple of major strands within the Democratic Party. So one strand that's very much on the rise is the economic populist component of the Democratic Party. And there's historically been some overlap between economic populists and social progressives, though it is not true that all economic populists necessarily are social progressives, in the sense that you can run a candidate who is very tough on corporations, very tough on billionaires, supports the working class, but is also skeptical, for example, of mass migration or trans rights. So in terms of economic populists, probably the most famous figures in the economic populist camp are people like Bernie Sanders or AOC, now Zohran Mamdani in New York City, the DSAs, the Democratic Socialist movement within the United States, that more or less promotes a pretty directly economic populist agenda. What does economic populism entail? It mostly promotes the working class through a attack on corporate power and expanded government involvement in the market. There's a specific component of the economic populist movement that you might call the neo-Brandeis movement, named after Louis Brandeis, the former Supreme Court justice back in the early 1900s, who had some pretty well-known writings on antitrust. And in the modern day, Lina Khan, who was the former FTC chair and the fairly famous author of some papers about breaking up large corporations like Amazon, Lina Khan is probably the de facto figurehead of this movement, places particular emphasis on the use of antitrust to break up centralized corporate power. Economic populism is the movement that will probably, if I had to guess, gain the most ground in the Democratic Party in the next 1 to maybe 3 years. It's the component of the Democratic Party that seems to show the potentially greatest ability to directly challenge Trump on the issue that he's weakest on, namely the economy. Now, there's a second component of the Democratic movement, which is related to economic populists, which is the sort of social progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now, there were large parts of the Democratic Party in the last 5 to 10 years that have focused pretty overtly on social issues as one of the most important issues in their arsenal. Admittedly, this camp has probably downsized to a reasonable extent, with the maybe exception of resistance liberals that I'll talk about in a second. And part of the reason for this is that there is more and more recognition within the Democratic Party after 2024 that a major focus on quote unquote woke social issues is pretty bad for electability. Lots of working class voters are not particularly keen on voting for a party that makes sort of ostensibly left-leaning social issues the forefront of its campaign. So there are lots of candidates nowadays in the Democratic Party who are socially progressive, but they don't make it the centerpiece of their campaign. Now, that being said, although it's a bit probably inaccurate to apply this label directly to Kamala Harris, there are still very much huge parts of the Democratic Party that believe in social messaging. And if you don't trust me, just think about Kamala Harris's campaign. A huge part of what Kamala Harris tried to convince the United States of and the American electorate of is that Donald Trump is a threat to abortion rights and a threat to democratic freedoms. This is fundamentally, at least in the first case, a social and cultural argument. So although social progressives have probably lost some steam since the 2024 election, that faction of the party remained integrated with others. In terms of the moderate factions, there's lots of variance between moderates in the Democratic Party. And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that it's not always clear who is or is not a moderate. There's an example I was planning to use later that I might just skip ahead. Maybe I have it too much later. I guess I'll highlight kind of here. I guess I'll kind of highlight this here as an interesting example of the difficulty of categorizing moderates. Here is this guy who's running for a Texas Senate seat. Some people have even floated his name as a potential presidential candidate. And what's interesting about Tallarico is if you look at how he campaigns and how he frames himself, he very much is trying to seem like a moderate. So he repeatedly talks about being a devout Christian. He went on the Joe Rogan podcast. He emphasizes his working class roots. Lots of things that you look at this guy and you think, yeah, this guy's a moderate. But if you actually look at much of his policy platform, the things he says he believes in, the policies he supports, it's pretty surprisingly progressive in terms of gun control legislation in Texas, hardly a state famed for its, anti-gun beliefs, expansive protection for LGBTQ rights, permitting undocumented migrants to pay in-state tuition at Texas universities. So, is this guy a moderate or a progressive? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask. If you ask the policies, he's probably a progressive. If you ask voters who are listening to his messages, they might very well say that he is a moderate. So that's why it's a little bit difficult to categorize moderates. But there are a couple of components of the moderate camp that are worth thinking through. There's one general camp of just kind of traditional Democrats, traditional center-left Democrats, think someone like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, et cetera. And these are the Democrats that kind of have the traditional Democratic focus, a social safety net, protections for workers, taxes on the rich, government-led market reforms, some focus on protecting marginalized communities, and so forth. And then there's a couple of strands within that. So one is what you might call blue dog liberalism. Blue dog refers to a faction of Democrats in the House that are really much more centrist slash even center right on lots of issues, particularly social issues. And that's the faction of the Democratic Party that's really much more focused on moderation and compromise on issues that the progressive faction of the party finds highly disagreeable. Abundance liberalism is relatively new. It's inspired by the Abundance Agenda. That was a book published in, I think, April or so of 2025. Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein. The abundance liberalism agenda focuses on YIMBYism, the idea of yes in my backyard. It aims to, this is a simplification. You should really read the book, I suppose, but it aims to sort of reduce supply shortages, reduce prices, increase affordability by making it easier to build, to develop infrastructure, to build housing, to develop energy. And that entails lots of measures aimed at making it easier for both governments and private developers to do things like build, get permits, evade regulatory zoning systems, and so forth. And then there's also a neoliberal faction of the liberal movement. These are folks that are more supportive of expansions of the social safety net within reasonable proportion to not expand the deficit, international support for the US-led order, stuff like that. The last group that's a little bit tricky, I'm borrowing this category from a series of writers that have talked about this as a distinct set of Democrats. So, for example, Nate Silver, who used to run 538, has sort of wrote an interesting blog post about this. But there's arguably a fourth camp of the Democratic Party that you might think of as the hashtag resistance liberals. So, for context, hashtag resistance is sort of the name that's been given to the kind of bastion of Democrats that are working to resist Trump, like, for example, the No Kings protest. And resistance liberals are principally driven by an opposition to Trump and Trump's policies. Resistance liberals are an interesting example, though, of where the Democratic Party is today, which is just to say that the resistance liberal movement is, on average, a bit older, a bit better educated, and does focus quite a lot on social issues. So, for example, if you look at polls of people who turn out to No Kings protests and ask, what are you turning out to protest? A lot of it are things that are a little bit more on the social or cultural end of things, like the attack on universities, immigrant rights, trans rights, abortion rights, attacks on science, etc. Now, that's not necessarily bad. These are all very real concerns, but it does raise questions about the degree to which resistance liberals are electable in an age in which economic issues are potentially the better path to victory for the Democrats. So this is, for example, a different way of categorizing competing conceptions of the Democratic Party that kind of covers some of the similar features, but names or identifies them in different ways. Now, right now, there are sort of two major debates going on. That's an exaggeration. There are more than two. There's a couple of major debates going on within the Democratic Party. And one of them is what lessons should the Democrats take away from 2024? And the other is what you might call the wins above replacement war. The concept of wins above replacement is what sort of Democratic candidate tends to perform best in elections? And the idea here basically is you sort of could run more moderate centrist candidates that are going to be more right-wing on some social issues and maybe a bit more populist on some economic issues in an attempt to appeal to the working class. And there's also a different approach that says, no, what Democrats really need to do is to shift more to the left, to embrace progressivism, to embrace populism, and to really energize the Democratic base that feels abandoned by a corporate, stagnant, sort of oldish party. And so that's the war debate of sorts. What sort of candidate tends to outperform? I'll note that I'm going to show a lot of statistics and graphs on the screen. These obviously are a bit complicated, and there's pretty major debate about all of these, about how you categorize moderate versus progressive, how you track the probability a candidate is going to win, how you evaluate success. So all of this has lots of methodological questions. But before I get into the methodological stuff, and just worth briefly reviewing that there are two competing ways that you can think about winning elections. One is you can focus on persuading voters to vote for you. And the other is to mobilize existing supporters to turn out to the polls. And each of these two strategies sort of appeals to different factions of the Democratic Party. So let's start with the case for moderation. The New York Times a couple of weeks ago put out a fairly well-read piece about why centrism is probably the path forward for the Democrats. The short version of what centrism entails is A, shifting away from social issues as the priority in campaigns and focusing more on a affordability agenda, though not necessarily a socialist or populist agenda. This would entail endorsing policies which are likely to reduce the cost of living and potentially framing this through the language of fairness. And relatedly and more controversially, centrism entails moderating stances where Democrats are unpopular vis-a-vis culture and social issues. So examples might be moderating on abortion, border security, trans participation in women's sports, so on and so forth. Now, one common argument that's made against this claim is, look, the Democrats are already pretty damn centrist. It doesn't really seem like a further shift towards the center is going to do much. If Republicans really think that Democrats are crazy woke leftists, they're going to think that regardless. One of the responses that's often made to this argument is that Democrats will need to have a quote unquote sister soldier moment. They'll basically need to, at some point, publicly and firmly denounce on a larger scale this more progressive flank of the party in order to change the party's national image. Now, there is some compelling empirical evidence that says that progressive candidates, for example, candidates that were endorsed by more progressive advocacy groups or lobby groups like Justice Democrats, tend to perform worse compared to those that are more moderate on average. In fact, this is actually true on both ends of the political spectrum. Moderate Republicans also tend to outperform Trump. And there's a fair claim that says, look, the Democrats tried the strategy of shifting left. They shifted left on just about every major social and cultural issue. And unfortunately, they lost ground because people saw the Democratic Party as shifting to the left faster than they shifted to the left in a way that made Democrats fairly out of touch, including with many of the demographics the Democratic Party claimed to be helping. There's this great study that came out from the Center for Working Class Politics that has this really pretty shocking conclusion, which basically is that if you run two candidates in front of voters and you ask, which of these two candidates would you prefer, lots of working class voters will actually prefer candidates that are not affiliated with the Democratic Party, i.e., independent candidates, just literally because just those candidates do not have the Democratic Party name attached to them, because the Democratic Party label is so associated with being out of touch, with being highly educated, with being highly corporate, with being very socially left-wing in a way that's not always aligned with working class communities. And that really does create problems for the Democrats. So, for example, Sherrod Brown suffered an unfortunate loss in the Ohio Senate race last year, partially because he was sort of torn down by this national brand of the Democrats as being out of touch. There's this interesting ad. I won't play it here, but you can play it for yourself. Here's this guy from I think Maine. If I'm not, I think so. Hopefully I haven't forgotten this already. But Jared Golden, if you watch this advertisement, maybe I'll play it with the sound off here. But if you sort of just watch it, one of the like shocking takeaways, like I guess I'll just let you sort of read what shows up on screen. But like as you hear what he sort of talks about and his stance towards the Democratic Party, you might plausibly be like, how on earth is, this guy a Democrat? Well, it's because like he's explicitly like literally telling voters that he is bucking Biden and going against what the Democrats want and working with Trump. And part of the reason for this is that if the Democratic brand is nationally toxic, one of the best things to do is to distance yourself from that toxic brand. And that might be evidence that Democrats holistically are a bit perceived as out of touch. Again, here's a good example of kind of taking a more centrist stance on policing and on immigration. Another interesting example of where the centrist progressive split shows competing results. Stacey Abrams ran a much more progressive campaign in Georgia, lost. Raphael Warnock, more moderate centrist campaign, and won. That's an oversimplification, but I'm just giving the highlight there. There's some empirical evidence of this, the phenomena whereby Democrats have shifted left. Is an increased focus, especially on social issues in the Democratic Party, particularly in the last 12, 15, perhaps years. And as a consequence, many voters do view the Democratic Party as too left-leaning and out of touch. And part of that is because if you look at the things that Democrats seem to care most about compared to what Americans want them to focus on, there's a major disconnect between the focus on social issues when economic issues really do seem to be driving a huge number of voters' behavior. This is sort of further empirical evidence of the disconnect between Democratic priorities and voter priorities. And one of the reasons that's a major problem is look at where the Democrats need to be winning in 2026. This is a geographic representation of the Senate races in 2026. You can break them down by, for example, deep blue means basically guaranteed to go blue. Deep red, basically guaranteed to go red. For example, the Democrats really aren't in a position to capture Wyoming's Senate seat, for instance. But there's lots of these toss-up states, places where they really could potentially go either way. But in order for that to work, the Democrats are going to need to win some tough races in places like Georgia or North Carolina or Maine, where they're going to have to appeal to people that don't have necessarily very highly progressive social issues and aren't willing to vote for a highly progressive, highly populist candidate that they associate with a fairly corrupt and or incompetent Democratic Party. Now, with all of that being said, the argument that centrists make is, look, we have to moderate in order to be electable. But there's a fair claim that says, is this actually just? I mean, if you're shifting right on social issues, trans rights, immigrant rights, etc., you're basically throwing minorities and vulnerable communities under the bus in order to gain some ground in the polls. And there's a real argument that says this is not a moral strategy. And that's why lots, for example, of progressives are pretty frustrated with Gavin Newsom, who has sort of weaponized the opportunity to suddenly seem more right-wing on immigration and culture than he was previously, just for sake of gaining ground. That sort of segues into how you might defend the progressive stance, the claim that Democrats should, in fact, shift a bit more towards the left. And the core argument here is what you might call the mobilization hypothesis. This is the claim that if you want to win elections, the real thing that you should do is mobilize the base. And the base of the Democratic Party has left the party. This is what's called class de-alignment, the shift of working class voters towards the Republican Party. And if you want to win those voters back, what you have to do is to convince them that you are going to change a broken status quo and that you are going to fight for their economic well-being, tackle billionaires and multinational corporations. And in an age where polarization is at record high levels, it might be a little bit hard for you to actually get that many more people to vote for you via persuasion, but you can sure as hell mobilize your base to turn out. One of the other related reasons, maybe, why persuasion is less effective than mobilization is just Democrats have been doing the moderate strategy for quite some time, and to some extent, they've exhausted the gains that come from running very moderate candidates. And so, as a consequence, the better strategy might be run populist candidates who speak to working class communities in firm and direct ways in a manner that energizes their frustrations and appeals to their emotions, much as Trump has also happened to do. And that's especially useful for the Democrats now because the Republicans have more or less teed the Democrats up for a slam dunk win in 2026 by imposing a series of unpopular policies that are pretty bad for the working class, like tax breaks for the rich and gutting Medicaid. The reason why all of this matters, then, you might say, if you're making the progressive case, is that you need a powerful narrative to win an election. It's not just enough, as a moderate might to have a couple of nice policies that people need. You need a story to sell voters, a narrative of the greedy billionaire class extorting wealth from working class Americans and populists being the ones to right the ship. And one of the other related arguments you might make for why populism and progressivism is the path forward is that the evidence that voters penalize extreme candidates is maybe not as strong as it once was. One very boring example of this might literally just be Trump. Trump is, by many accounts, a more extreme candidate on lots of issues, but has still attracted a wide base of support from very many voters. And in the age of hyperpolarization, there are tons of Republican voters who, yeah, will hate the extreme candidates, but they're already so fully sold on the Republican Party that not much is changing. There's an interesting academic paper that actually tests this more or less directly. To what extent do ideological extremists suffer a quote unquote penalty in elections? And the answer is there is some extremism penalty, but it's less in effect than the mobilization effect of convincing your base to turn out and vote. And so to that extent, yeah, extremism or perceived extremism is going to alienate some people, but it might very well mobilize even more of them. One of the most recent examples of this in action is Zohran Mamdani, the current mayor-elect in New York City. He was originally polling at something like 1%. Very, very few people thought this guy was going to win, but the reason he ended up winning in part was by embracing an affordability-centric economic populist agenda where he advocated for freezing the rent and raising taxes on the rich and running or offering free universal childcare and government-run grocery stores to offer affordable groceries and free buses. Are all of these policies great? No. Some of them are going to cause problems, but there is a very real way in which that populist messaging appeals towards people's, in particular working class people's, frustrations with the status quo. Now, there is a fair competing explanation for Mamdani's win, which is just that the alternatives to Mamdani in the general were disastrous. It was Andrew Cuomo, who's both a terrible human being and a record with a former governor with a shoddy record. And Sliwa, the Republican candidate, who really was never that viable. But that being said, like Mamdani had to win the primary to get to the general, and to win the primary, Mamdani really did have to convince Democrats that he was the path forward. And it turns out that running a really good campaign that makes effective use of visual media and vertical shots on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, coupled with an economic populist message, can be quite effective in energizing people to turn out and vote. By the way, Mamdani has arguably single-handedly, coupled with a couple of other key figures like Spanberger, for instance, has really popularized the term affordability in politics. It's really popping up everywhere now in the United States. And this trend is not just limited to Mamdani. So, for example, Dan Osborne, former mechanic, is a guy who ran an independent campaign for Senate in Nebraska against Deb Fischer, the Republican incumbent. Dan Osborne ran on an economic populist agenda. He explicitly chose not to run with the Democratic Party and rejected their endorsement because he didn't want the Democratic penalty attached to him. He didn't want the name of the Democrats ruining his brand. And Osborne did ultimately lose. It was about a 7-point margin. But Osborne put up maybe the best performance against a Republican in Nebraska in 50 plus years, pretty much, in a state that no one thought was competitive. Democrats more or less didn't even run anyone in the Nebraska state because they literally thought the race was a foregone conclusion. And what that might be evidence of is like you really can galvanize pretty mass support by running on a populist agenda. Now, again, this is a good example of the confusing distinction between progressive and centrist. Is Osborne a centrist? Well, it's a little odd, which is to say that his social stances are not going to make progressives happy, but his economic stances are much closer towards a populist's angle than a centrist's angle. So it's a bit difficult to characterize some of these things. I talked about Tallarico a bit earlier, but here's another interesting example of running a progressive candidate, but framing them through sort of more moderate language. Of course, there are risks with economic messaging that is populist in nature. One risk is probably the most obvious. Democrats have lots of very wealthy donors, billionaire donors, corporate donors, and there's a risk of alienating those groups if you start embracing rhetoric that sounds awfully socialist. There's also another related concern, which is lots of voters do support economic populism, it's true, but anti-socialist sentiment remains very powerful and potent in the United States in a way that means that a populist agenda does risk being labeled socialist or communist. That's part of how Republicans have tried to criticize Mamdani and his association with the Democratic brand writ large. Another problem is that populist messaging might be persuasive in campaigns, but ineffective in actually solving problems once in governance. The example that Ezra Klein likes to point to in Abundance, for example, is the principal enemy, according to an economic populist, is the rigged system of capitalism. And the principal villains in that story are billionaires and large corporations. And of course, there's some truth in that as causing the rising cost of housing and groceries, etc. But in some cases, there are other groups that are responsible for economic and political malaise. So a simple example would be one of the reasons it's really hard to build housing in the United States is because the bureaucratic process that you have to pass through to build even just a simple house is ridiculously complicated and gives tons of veto power to various activist groups and labor unions. And if you want to build things fast in the United States, you're going to have to curb the power of those groups. That's not popular with progressives, but it is very much an issue that you're going to need to address head on. The other problem with economic populist messaging is you might be able to say, hey, economic populism is great, but that still requires effective political communication. And lots of Democratic politicians are not capable of conversing effectively on these issues. And that's also an issue where if just some Democrats embrace economic populist messaging, but the brand itself remains sort of identitarianly corporate, then the effect might be relatively limited. Well, on the subject of money and the effect of corporate donations, it's worth just briefly discussing the role of money in American politics. Citizens United is the famous U.S. Supreme Court case that legally permitted, on a larger scale than previous Supreme Court cases, the use of financing in campaigns. And there are several ways in which money affects politics. One of the most under-discussed ones in debate is that second effect, what's called, what I would sort of call the primary filter. Remember, in the United States, you need to win both the primary election and the general election in order to gain office. But one of the biggest problems with running in a primary election is where do you get the money? You don't have name recognition. You don't have the endorsement of the party. It's very hard for you to literally even get your name out. Heck, get your name on the ballot for the primary election if you don't have some initial money. So whether or not you have money in the early stages of your campaign has a pretty major influence on who even gets to the general election in the first place. Of course, the more well-known ways in which money influences politics are campaign financing and lobbying, wherein the concept of campaign finances is you can donate money to a politician that can increase that politician's electability. For example, they have more money to hire consultants, to engage in phone banking, canvassing, run advertisements, etc. And you can also use money on direct lobbying to basically convince politicians that your views are the best. It's worth noting the rise of tech and also crypto specifically in politics. Historically, although the United States has a major reputation for campaign finance, historically no one individual corporation or industry ever spent really that much money. I mean, you're talking millions upon millions of dollars, but really 2024 was the first true explosion of massive amounts of wealth being invested into electoral races. Elon Musk is a good example of this, spending hundreds of millions of dollars in politics to back Trump. But the other two ones that are perhaps even more influential or better known are Fair Shake and the more recently formed Leading the Future. Leading the Future is a sort of AI PAC, a group of political donors, basically. There is a bit of irony that AIPAC is already taken by the Israeli lobby. And Fair Shake was the one that was formed by Mark Andreessen and sort of represented his venture capital fund prior to the 2024 elections. And Fair Shake and Leading the Future have just blown away other PACs in terms of money raised. And it does really represent the rise of big tech and crypto as dominant forces in American politics and the ability to pretty substantially interfere with elections by manipulating voters' attitudes and beliefs. That leads us nicely into talking about upcoming elections down the road in 2028 being the main one, i.e. the upcoming presidential. Several months ago, Steve Bannon, the MAGA diehard, gave a very controversial interview with The Economist where he pretty openly said there is there is a plan for Trump to run for a third presidential term in 2028. Now, that runs into a bit of a problem called the 22nd Amendment because it is constitutionally prohibited for a president to run for a third term. Trump is a little bit unclear on his view on this. The current indication seems to be he doesn't believe he can run for a third term and probably won't, though there probably are people around him who have tried to devise ways around that. The more likely outcome realistically is that Trump probably doesn't run. The question is who ends up succeeding Trump. The two main frontrunners at this moment are the current vice president and current secretary of state, those being J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. There's a pretty good chance, if I had to guess, though of course that's just my opinion and just speculation, that they might run as a joint ticket, maybe J.D. as the president, Marco as the vice president. But there's a pretty realistic chance that that ends up being the 2028 combination. J.D. Vance is currently being given pretty good odds on betting markets. Of course, it's early. It's still 2025. Realistically, soon it'll be 26. And so there's a lot that can change between now and then. The Democratic side of the ledger is much more open. So just to give a couple of names that you might want to be familiar with, there's Mark Kelly down in the bottom right. His stock has really elevated in the last month or 2 months as Trump has really attacked him, and that's given him lots of ammunition to run on. Kamala Harris, in a move that, this is my opinion, not a fact, but in a move that I find absolutely bizarre, has seemingly floated that she's open to running again. I can't fathom why the Democratic Party would have any confidence that Harris would fare any better a second time around after already losing again. That there is the governor of Illinois, center right up top, Pete Buttigieg, who ran in 2020 and had some success in the primaries. He's the former mayor of South Bend. He also played a role in the Department of Transportation in the Biden administration. Fairly effective, moderate, very effective communicator. Gavin Newsom is in the top left there. He's widely considered the front runner if you just look at betting market odds. That being said, it's not clear that he'll necessarily continue that position. One of the main risks with Gavin Newsom is that Newsom is the governor of California through early 27. And one of the issues with California is A, it's widely regarded as one of the least popular states in the United States in terms of governance quality. And B, and more importantly, Newsom governs the least affordable state in the country. And that's going to be a bit of an issue if the Democrats are serious about running on an affordability-centric platform. AOC, meanwhile, is the progressives' probably best bet for winning the presidency. She is probably, depending on what markets you're looking at, polling or being given odds somewhere in the ballpark of second place. She was recently asked if she thinks she'd beat JD in a presidential election, and she was pretty enthusiastic about those odds. Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, also in the race. These are all a bunch of candidates that potentially come into the picture for the Democrats. A couple of questions that you'd want to think about in debates about the Democrats' runs in 2028. First, which of these candidates is best positioned to win in swing states? Those are states like, for instance, Georgia, Pennsylvania, etc. The second thing you'd want to think about is which of these candidates is best positioned specifically to challenge the Republicans on the issues that they're weakest at. Things like, for instance, high rates of inflation, high rates of tariffs, the mismanagement of the economy, mismanagement of healthcare, etc. So which of these candidates is best positioned to attack that? And of course, you also want candidates that are the least likely to alienate existing Democratic supporters or turn Democratic supporters away, and perhaps shift that trend towards class de-alignment in a way that means the Democrats can capture more and more of the working class vote. Those are some questions to leave you with and think about in debates about the Democratic Party's future. Hope this was helpful, and best of luck in your debate.